Good evening. We will now open the City of Seal Beach Planning Commission for Wednesday, April 3rd. Can we have a Pledge of Allegiance by Mr. Sloan?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
How about that for fast? Can we have the roll call, please?
Commissioner Sloan? Here. Vice Chair Cummings?
Here.
Commissioner Goldberg? Commissioner Campbell?
Here.
Chairperson Massa-Levitt?
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum?
Thank you. This is for the approval of the agenda by motion of the Planning Commission. This is the time to notify the public of any changes to the agenda, rearrange the order of the agenda, and provide an opportunity for any member of the Planning Commission or staff to request an item be removed from the consent calendar for separate action. Is there a change to the agenda by any of the commission? None. Okay, we will entertain a motion to adopt the agenda. So moved. Second, please.
Second.
Vote. 5-0. Agenda is approved. Oral communication. At this time, members of the public may address the Planning Commission regarding any item within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Commission. Pursuant to the Brown Act, the Commission cannot discuss or take action on any items not on the agenda unless authorized by law. Those members of the public wishing to speak are asked to come forward to the microphone, state their name for the record. All speakers will be limited to a period of 5 minutes. This is the point on the agenda for the public to speak up on an item that is not on the agenda. If you have something else you would like to have us hear, we would be glad to hear that now.
Hi, good evening, Chairman Massa-Levitt, members of the Commission, staff, the public, Seth Eaker, representing Chamber of Commerce and Run Seal Beach. So an exciting time coming up this month, ladies and gentlemen. Run Seal Beach coming up this April 13th, Saturday. If you haven't signed up, sign up now, runsealbeach.com. It's going to be awesome. We're really excited about our sponsors, our participants. I'm pleased to announce that the Kids 1K Fun Run has now tipped over the 300 kids mark. We have 301 as of today. And the last day to register for this fabulous event is Tuesday at midnight of next week. So if you haven't gone online, go online now to runsealbeach.com. Also, I missed doing it at City Council last meeting, and I wanted to do it at Planning Commission. I really wanted to, on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, do a shout out to our police and all of our safety officials and the Lions for a really safe and sane St. Patrick's Day. That was really terrific. Sure do appreciate the Lions, the police, city staff, and all those people that contributed to, I think, a really successful, profitable, and most importantly, safe St. Patrick's Day here in our Main Street corridor. And that concludes my report. Thank you.
Mr. Eaker, may I ask you a question?
Of course, Madam Chair.
Are you running in the run?
I am not. I cannot tell a lie. I'm not running in the run. I'm not walking in the run. However, I have kind of a unique job. On that day, I'm privileged to be kind of the voice of the start line. And the challenge is we're timed very, very quickly, because by the time I launch the last walkers and they round the corner, the 5K finisher is looping onto Marina, and I have to leap into a little whizzy cart and race to the finish line to announce that person before they can round the turn on Ocean. So it is kind of a exciting battle for me that day. So I'll be at both the start and the finish line. In the finish line, I'll be co-hosted with SBTV's Joe Dawson from Studio Cafe, so it'll be a real treat.
Good.
So, thanks.
Thank you.
Seth, what's first prize?
Sorry?
What's first prize?
What is first prize?
Prize, yes.
That's a great question. So there are actually 19 categories.
Oh, gosh.
By age. We give medals for all 3 events, first, second, and third, in all 19 categories in both genders. So it's a lot of medals. However, Commissioner Sloan, specifically, there are some very special awards. That's the fastest man and woman in the 5K and the 10K. And in addition, we do the fastest resident in the 5K and the 10K. And the fastest resident goes on a perpetual plaque in City Hall, as does the fastest winner of both of those races. So they get a plaque. They're getting some very cool water bottles, some medals, some other things. So it's a little different this year. Last year they got picture frames. So that would be first prize, I think, as you perhaps are looking for it. Yes. Any other questions? Wow, that's unusual.
I have a question.
Oh, I love it. Wow, it's my lucky
Can
night.
you register and not run?
Absolutely. We would love to have you register and merely participate as a spectator or as a walker. You can walk in the 5K. The only thing is you can't register for the 1K fun run unless you're a child.
Oh.
So, Mr.
about
Cummings, if
my
that was your
street.
hope to get by with just a 1K, unless you're a minor, you're not able to do that.
Okay. You can fake it.
But, yeah. Any other questions? Wow, I'm
Thank you,
dazzled.
sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have one item on the consent calendar. There wasn't anyone else who wanted to speak up, was there? Okay. The consent calendar is approval of the Planning Commission meeting minutes of March 20th. Can we have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second. Okay. Please vote. Who
I pushed the
You
wrong
were-
button. I meant to push abstain.
abstain?
Yes.
Okay, so we have
Abstain.
4 approvals and 1 abstention for not being here. Okay. There are no scheduled matters, and our first public hearing is Municipal Code Amendment MCA 13-1 citywide regarding senior housing, single-room occupancy housing, transitional and supportive housing, emergency shelters, and off-street parking. Can we have the staff report, please?
Yes, Madam Chair, we do have staff report for each one of these items that will be facilitated by our consultant, John Douglas.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. As you know, there are quite a few items on your agenda tonight. Most of them are implementation items from the previous housing element. I alluded to those in the study session a few moments ago. And so you have quite a bit to consider on your plate tonight. This item actually has 5 subparts to it, but on this slide I added another item at the bottom of the list, which is not the item that's before you right now, but it's on the agenda later. So I apologize for that confusion. But the items that are part of this agenda issue have to do with zoning regulations for senior housing, for single-room occupancy housing, for transitional and supportive housing, for emergency shelters, and for parking. So, again, these are all implementation items that were called for as part of the previous housing element. When I say previous housing element, I mean the one that's in effect today. the one that we talked about in the study session is the next housing element. So let me briefly go through these one by one. I might say at the beginning that what we're asking for from you tonight is the adoption of a resolution recommending an ordinance to the City Council. And in your agenda packet, there is a resolution and a draft ordinance for your consideration that contains the detailed language of each of these code amendments. So the first issue has to do with the city's regulations for senior age-restricted housing. And this is fairly simple. It's an amendment that would make the regulations for senior housing the same as for non-age restricted housing. In the current zoning code, there are some limitations that are put on senior housing that are not the case for non-age restricted housing. And so this is simply to standardize the regulations to make the rules the same for senior housing as opposed to conventional housing.
Excuse me, may I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Is that dictated by state law, or is that dictated by our own housing element?
It is dictated by state law, and this was an issue that came up during the review of the city's ordinances as part of the last housing element update. And so state HCD, when they were reviewing our housing element, they asked us about this and pointed out to us that in order to be consistent with state law, the city should allow senior housing under the same rules as non-age restricted housing. The second item in this package is for SRO, single room occupancy housing. Again, this comes out of state law. State housing element law says jurisdictions should accommodate a wide variety of housing types as part of their zoning regulations in order to accommodate all different types of persons and households. And so single-room occupancy housing addresses the needs at the lower income end of the spectrum. They are typically very small. You might think of them as a motel type size. The ordinance, the draft ordinance that's in front of you would establish minimum unit sizes depending on the number of persons who are occupying the unit. And so if it's a single person studio, then there would be a minimum of 150 square feet. And if two people are occupying the unit, it'd be a minimum of 200 square feet. These types of facilities would be allowed subject to a conditional use permit from your planning commission in the residential high-density zone. And there is a list of amenities in the ordinance that would be required for any project under these regulations. And those are in the attached ordinance. But if you have any questions on those, I'd be happy to talk about them in more specifics. The third item in this package has to do with transitional and supportive housing. And just by definition, state law was amended a few years ago to clarify that these types of housing, these types of facilities are housing units. They're treated as housing units as opposed to some other kind of land use category. They're not commercial, they're not institutional, they are regulated as housing. And so state law says that cities in their zoning ordinances have to apply the same standards to transitional and supportive housing as they do to any conventional type of residential use. So, for example, if a nonprofit service agency owns a single-family home and they operate it as a transitional facility where they would place a family in it, then the city cannot impose any additional regulations or permit requirements for that home than they would for any conventional single-family home. And this is a state law that applies to every jurisdiction in the state. The difference between transitional and supportive housing is that supportive housing has supportive services that go along with it. And so, for example, if supportive housing is typically targeted at people who have special needs, people with disabilities, people who need assistance in their daily living, assistance with taking their medications, and so forth. And so, again, a nonprofit type organization might operate a supportive housing facility where those kinds of services are provided in connection with the tenancy of the unit. Same rules apply to transitional and to supportive housing, as I just described. One other thing I might mention that sometimes comes up on the topic of transitional and supportive housing is how does this relate to group homes and the law that pertains to group homes or rehab facilities and that type of thing. And the way I interpret it is that the law that governs transitional and supportive housing doesn't change the regulations that apply to group homes. So in other words, if someone were to come to the city and say, I have a, quote, transitional housing facility for 10 people that I want to operate in a single-family home, and you have to let me do that because of the law that applies to transitional housing, the city is within its rights to regulate that as a group home, the same way they do today. And the state law pertaining to group homes says that if a group home has 6 or fewer clients living within it, then the city is restricted in how it can regulate that, has to regulate it as a single-family use. So this change in the municipal code would not open the doors in any respect with regard to group homes. The next item in this bundle of amendments has to do with parking. This comes out of state law and, in fact, is required already under state density bonus law, so that the city would be simply conforming its regulations on parking for small units that are within an affordable housing development, such that studio and one-bedroom units would only be required to have one off-street parking space. Again, this is already required by state law, and it would simply be conforming to the existing state rules. The next item in this package has to do with creating the regulations that apply to emergency shelters. Comes out of state law, the same state law actually that applies to transitional and supportive housing. And that law was part of the housing element update last time, and the amendment to the code was a program from the housing element. That state law requires every city in the state to identify at least one zoning district where emergency shelters can be established by a simple administrative procedure. And so this ordinance would conform the city's regulations to the requirements of state law. It would establish a definition in the municipal code, and it would establish the development standards for emergency shelters. Those development standards would put a cap of 10 beds on an emergency shelter and require separation between emergency shelters at least 300 feet, would require the operator to submit a management plan to the city. And the management plan would include their hours of operation and their staffing, security, intake, procedures, and so forth. Now, I put on this slide the reference to the Boeing specific plan, although it's technically part of the next item on your agenda, but I'll go ahead and mention it now, and then we can talk in a little bit more detail on the next item. In conjunction with this amendment to the municipal code, the next item has to do with an amendment to the Boeing specific plan to establish that emergency shelters are allowed within the Boeing specific plan. So the two work together to satisfy the requirements of state law.
So is it appropriate then, Mr. Attorney, to consider these separately or together? This amendment and the Boeing specific plan, since it has the sites on it for the emergency.
Yes, you can actually, these were noticed as separate public hearings,
Mhm.
but you can invite the public to speak on both items at the same time, and then you could actually make a decision on the two separate resolutions.
Okay. Is there any objection from the rest of the commission to handling both of these together?
I think they are separate.
Well, they are separate, you don't,
Because this one, you're saying that what we're saying with this agenda item is that the Boeing integrated systems area will be the location. In the next agenda item, there's more detail in that regarding which planning area within that, and I don't really want to mix those two.
okay. Any other comments? Okay, then we'll keep them
I think it's
separate.
simpler to keep them separate.
Okay, we'll do that. All right, are there any questions of the staff from the commission? Go ahead, Dr. Goldberg.
On page 7 of the draft ordinance, at the top regarding single-room occupancy, there's a statement that says that single-room occupancy hotels shall conform with the following. I don't understand the reference to hotels. I wasn't thinking that these were going to be hotels. Why is that word there?
Yeah, that's a good point, Commissioner. Oftentimes they are referred to as SRO hotels, but they are not hotels. Hotels are short-term occupancy, but SRO housing is intended to operate like an apartment, longer term, over 30 days occupancy. So that could be a confusing word to have in the ordinance.
Can we strike that word? I mean, that word's not required by state law, is it?
It is not required by state law, no. The term single-room occupancy, I believe, is sufficient. I would defer to the city attorney if he has a recommendation on whether to strike the word hotel.
If that's the wishes of the commission, your recommendation can change hotels to units.
The second question I had is we're making a lot of changes regarding density. The single-room occupancy obviously is for much smaller units. Will any of the changes in this ordinance bring any of our units that are currently non-conforming in Old Town into conformance? For example, we have properties where we have 3 units on one property non-conforming. We've got places like that are underparked. Will any of these either automatically bring some of those non-conforming properties into conformance, or alternatively, will they provide a mechanism for those owners to get minor use permits or conditional use permits to bring their properties into conformance? And I apologize for not giving you that question ahead of time. It just came to me.
I'm scratching my head on that because I'm not as familiar with you as all the non-conforming situations that may exist around the town. I think as a general rule, then if there were a non-conforming use that would become conforming as a result of any of these changes, then yes, it would have the effect that you're describing. But I'm just not personally familiar with any situation like that.
We have a lot of units over apartments, a lot of second units that are over garages that are now non-conforming, I believe, because it's two on a lot. But could that owner request a CUP from us to turn that small apartment, the garage apartment, or the apartment on top of the garage into an SRO, for example?
Let me go ahead, John, and answer that. Commissioner Goldberg, we would evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. So under your example, if somebody did present that as a proposal, we would take a look at the development standards that are before you this evening, that are proposed for adoption and recommendation to City Council. we can evaluate it to make the determination if it would fit under that definition and category as an SRO.
Can I ask another question? I'm sorry, but it's tied to yours.
Yes, please.
The rents for an SRO, are they regulated? I mean, you can't charge $1,200 a month for a 200-room SRO, right? Isn't it based on their income?
The rents would not be regulated under the ordinance that's before you. Now, there may be a developer or a nonprofit that would propose an affordable SRO to the city, but it's not required as part of this ordinance.
Dr. Goldberg?
No more questions, thank you.
The SRO is, one person is 150 square feet, and it says here, two people is 175 square feet, and on the slide that you showed earlier, it was 200 for two people, I thought.
Yes, I made a mistake. I'm sorry.
Okay. Which is right? Is it 200 or is it 175?
It is 175 per the ordinance.
Okay.
Okay. Let me ask another question, because I'm trying to get. I appreciate we have to do this by state law, and I will support this because we have to do it. I'm just trying to understand what the implications are in terms of real life in Old Town. If I currently own a house right now on a 25 by 100 foot or 115 foot lot, if this ordinance is passed, can I tear that house down and build a facility, an SRO facility with, I don't know how many units, 4 or 5 units? And then also, I see with the parking, it's a parking issue, but if I qualify for the parking, the one space per dwelling unit, and I can provide 4 or 5 parking spaces, could I tear down my house and put up a building with, say, 5 SROs and 5 parking spaces? Can I do that?
This ordinance would allow them in the RHD district. So are you referring
Yes.
to an IHD district?
Yes.
Then
In all RHD districts? Oh, that's high density. Residential high density only.
Yes.
And I'd have to get a conditional use permit to do that. I
Yes,
understand that.
that's right.
I'd have to get a conditional use permit.
Yes. So if there's an existing house in the RHD district, then the property owner would be able to come to the city and apply for a CUP to replace that with an SRO project as long as it met the standards.
Okay, thank you.
And also keep in mind there are density restrictions on the number of units or homes or complexes that you propose.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. I'm not seeing that here, and I'm not understanding that. If you can explain that.
You have to refer back to the zoning ordinance.
Well, you always refer back to what's allowed in a density classification. So if you're located in a residential density where your lot size is only 25 by 100, your 2,500 square foot lot, you're still restricted to the density required or the maximum allowed per that lot. Typically, SROs are structured towards large parcels for the purpose of accommodating multiple small units. And SROs started out as being referred to as hotels because hotels were converted into allowing this type of high occupancy to accommodate those who cannot afford typically an apartment unit in a downtown area. So that's where the concept comes from as far as a hotel as being the acronym or the other part of the definition. But it doesn't gain you any especially in Old Town area, trying to do that because you're still going to be restricted to the density allowed on that property, and that is always the case.
And the density you're referring to is, I don't have in front of me, 2187 square feet
If it's high-density
Plus or
residential,
minus.
20 units to the acre, or if it's
Okay.
residential low-density, 9 units to the acre, you always first compute what's allowed on the property.
Okay, so in Old Town, if I wanted to tear down a house and put these in, if my property was 50 by 100 and I had 5,000 square feet, then I could perhaps put 2 on a lot with these.
Perhaps, yes, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions from the commission?
Mr. Barrow, you concur with this, that this is all required by state law?
Oh, yes, definitely. We went through this process, and as you saw in the earlier study session, we submitted a draft housing element to HCD, and they came back and said, these are the changes that you have to make before you can get certified.
But a lot of those were recommendations on our part. They are now mandatory?
Well, they were initially, and John can help on this, initially they were not in the first draft, and they came back and said, these are the things that you need to add. And I know that was true on the senior, the changes to the senior, the first part of this, the senior apartments. And I'm pretty sure that was true for SROs as well.
Yes.
And transitional housing?
Yes.
Any other questions, Ms. Campbell?
This is just very insignificant, but there is a typo on page 8, and since you want documents to be correct. Section 7, it says, does not deny emergency shelter due to a person's inability to pay. You need to strike a couple of words there, okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the commission? Okay, we'll open it up to the public. Anyone like to speak on this item? Mr. Eaker?
Good evening, Commission. A pleasure to be before you again. Speaking on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, just a few key issues that we wanted to draw to the Commission's attention. Generally, on most of these items, the Chamber is generally supportive of these zone changes and understands the circumstances through which the Planning Commission and staff and the consultant have to work under. I guess I would express concern over that term hotel. I'm glad that already got called out. And then on page 6, under the new language with single-room occupancy SRO, it seems concerning to me that we're talking about something that's rented on a weekly basis or longer. Weekly basis, I don't know if that's part of the state requirement, but weekly basis, we just went through a huge community fight about vacation rentals, and those were all week or less. 30 days or less, and now we're putting in, wow, it looks to me like a vacation rental in a 200 square foot or less with a shared kitchen. So long as I have a bathroom, I can do that. So how? Yeah, too much partying in these single resident occupancies. So I guess I'm seeking to understand, not saying I'm opposed, just seeking to understand because that seems a little confusing. It also was confusing that these seem to be hotels, business use, if they're real short term. So then why would the Pacific Inn be treated differently? It's in a high-density residential zone. It could, in theory, apply for a conditional use permit for the single-room occupancy. All of them have a bathroom. They're all in that certain size. There could be a shared communal kitchen. There are amenities. So I guess I'm seeking to understand how a business use in a residential high-density area is being called out separately and distinctly. And I hope I'm not making Quinn apoplectic over there. The other thing that just seems a little concerning about the housing locations, and this is a general comment. So as the Chamber of Commerce, I went specifically to speak to Boeing through our contact there to get their input, and I did not receive any negative feedback about this from Boeing, and also with Community Development Director Bashan, he and I had a direct conversation, and I believe he has been in contact with Boeing people, and that we all seem to be on the same page about the emergency shelter issue. So from a business community perspective, that's kind of all the feedback I've got for you all on this item. So thank you very much.
Good evening, Jim Caviola. It's hard not to be disturbed sitting here listening to this. It really is disturbing. Welcome to the commission, Mr. Sloan. Thank you for serving. I really don't like to come down here. But, I'm sitting here, I hate to tell you this, but I worked and bought my house, busted my ass to buy that house. And to hear this, socialized, fascist, whatever you want to call it, is ridiculous. If it's state law, then it's state law. You're adopting. I don't think anyone you up there understands this either. You're sitting here listening to that. This is assisted. This is not, this is drug rehab.
Confiscation.
Yeah, this is a drug rehab. I'm an attorney. I deal with that. I have clients in those. Okay? And, if it's unfathomable that you can be approving that someone next to my house can put drug rehab in there, all right? So you were elected to protect our rights. This stuff about the law says, and you sitting here watching this guy put this stuff up here, no offense to this gentleman, but we went through this with the DW. I am so sick of the quote-unquote experts and everything's going to be okay thing. Sick of it, tired of it, done with it, really fed up with it. And this just smells rotten, really rotten. I can't tell you. Other than that, this is something wrong here. And as far as that Boeing thing, you've got about 10 acres or whatever sitting in Boeing. Someone should be planning the future with that. If you want to plan the future of that, that's fine. But high-density zoning is high-density zoning. We're already living with the high-density zoning, and that's not a problem. But to make it more high-density, to put more people in smaller rooms, it's a fire hazard. It's a social hazard. It's a safety hazard. These people have come from different elements. We work hard to buy these houses and live places, and we need to be protected. And you need to figure out what's going on here because it just is rotten. Something's wrong. I'm listening to this, and it doesn't sound like we're in the same country, okay, that I'm thinking I'm in, okay? Period. Thanks.
Thank you.
Madam Chairperson and members of the Commission. My name is Richard Bennett, and I live in Heron Point at 901 Blue Heron in Seal Beach, and I'm also the Heron Point HOA president. And I'm here today to tell you that we live very close to this proposed development in the Boeing area, and that we have not received any notification of this hearing today. And I was notified today through a friend of mine who is a CPA who told me about this hearing. I've fired off an email to all the members of Heron Point and received about a dozen of them so far stating that nobody has received any notification of this hearing today. So I'm here before you today to request that this hearing be continued to some other date where other members of my community can come here and speak out as well.
Could staff explain the hearing notices?
Madam Chair, the legal notification states it was mailed out to 138 property owners within a 500-foot radius. We also published this in the paper pursuant to the municipal code requirements.
If you're within 500-foot radius, you would have gotten a notice in the mail directly.
I believe Heron Point is probably the closest residence to that property.
It's sent to the property owner, so whoever owns the property between Boeing and 500 foot.
And also, Madam Chair, we went over and above to provide the mailing notification because by law, this is a citywide ordinance that affects residential high densities, not specifically one particular parcel. So the proper requirements is notification in the paper. But we went over and above to notify residences immediately within that area.
And which paper was this?
The Sun. Yes.
Our adjudicated newspaper is The Sun. So if you want to look for public hearing notices, that's where you have to look.
I see. All right, so there's no way to ask for a continuance of this hearing.
Well, I think you'll need to wait and see what happens.
Yes, and also, just so you know, This is the first step of the process for zoning changes. It has to go to the Planning Commission first, and they make a recommendation to the City Council, and then the City Council will also have a public hearing. So you'll have another opportunity to speak directly to the City Council. And an ordinance like this requires 2 readings. So you'll have a public hearing and a first reading potentially, and then another City Council meeting where there will be a second reading. And if you want to give your card, if you have anything, or give your address to the city clerk, I think we already have a schedule for that, or maybe it's tentative. I'm not sure the notice went out for the City Council yet.
No, notice has not gone out for the hearing.
But if you want to leave your name and number, we'll make sure you get personal notice of the hearings before the hearing before the City Council.
Okay, I just have another question here. So this is happening for the city of Seal Beach, and where my confusion comes into, people that live in Island Village were notified, and that's how I found out about it, who are Long Beach residents. So here, Long Beach residents being notified, but yet Seal Beach residents who live just as close to this property as they do were notified through mail.
That's because the bowling property is probably within 500 feet.
That's absolutely correct, Madam Chair.
Island View, it just jumps over the channel and at the edge of that property. So physically, if you look at a map, you can see the reason why.
Okay.
Yeah, please leave your name and your address with the city clerk.
All right.
And you'll be sure to get something in the mail.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I can direct a question to staff. Does staff know whether the 500-foot circle included any residences in Heron Point?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but again, we're only required to publish this in the paper because it's a citywide municipal code ordinance.
Your name, please.
Hi, my name is Libby Applegate. I just had a couple of observations here. If Accurate Storage is going to be zoned to residential, it's no longer going to be industrial. And I wondered if that can't be changed.
Could you hold up on Accurate Storage? We
Okay.
have the staff report and a couple of staff reports away
Okay.
from discussing Accurate Storage by itself.
Okay, and how about emergency shelters?
That's what we're doing now.
Later, okay. Now, okay. As far as emergency shelters, I noticed that the zoning of one of those buildings is always going to be 40 feet high. I'm not sure how many stories that is.
You
But the
generally
zoning is
figure
not going
4.
to change.
You can figure four floors.
Okay. And that's in the Boeing parking lot. I
Yes,
just wanted to make those 2 comments I was thinking about. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Madam Chairman, my name is George Derry, and I'm the CPA for Mr. Bennett. Basically, I practice down here at the Naples Plaza building in Long Beach. I've been down here for about 15 years. I live in the Island Village tract, and yes, I did receive notice, and I was the gentleman that called up to discuss it with my client because he does live close by, and at that time, he informed me that he did not receive any information regarding this, and he does live within a 500-foot area, and I know his title to his house is basically held in his name and his wife's. And they recently were married, and basically they've been before this group arguing vacation housing down by the supermarket. So I thought he might find it interesting that now that we're going to put up hotels with low rent occupancy when you could have high rent occupancy people or high dollar people occupying on a casual basis in Seal Beach. It appears to me, I've been a grand jury auditor for 5 Southern California grand juries. I've dealt with counties, I've dealt in a large firm basis, and I've never seen anything that would require this city to be passing this type of ordinance. I'm not that privy and up to date. I mean, I'm practicing as a local practitioner, but my days, I didn't think the government had that much capability to dictate this. And I presume you've had legal counsel basically look at this, or an outside law firm that basically say that you have to do this. I don't understand.
We have a city attorney.
Pardon me?
We have a city attorney that's vetted all of this.
Well, basically, there's no need to make the move. What's going to happen if you don't make the move? The other thing is that it's unacceptable traffic-wise to get that kind of parking and that kind of high density going up and down 2nd Street. We have a problem sitting down at Pacific Coast Highway. It takes almost 42 minutes to get from my residence down to the Long Beach Yacht Club on Friday night. Now, how is that going to impact the traffic going up and down 2nd Street in Westminster? It's going to be tremendous. And so basically, I was surprised by this action. I'm totally shocked by it. I think that there would be no one within Island Village that would be in favor of this project at this point in time. So thank you very much.
Anyone else?
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Mike Beebe, Old Town. It seems to me, hearing all the comments, that this is, even though it's been illegally noticed, it's come as a surprise to many South Beach residents. And I would just like to see in some part of the process, more voice given to Heron Point residents. And when I think of the Island Village is more of a geographic. It might be, within 500 feet, might be closer to the proposed change. But I think it's separated by geographical features more than Heron Point, and I think we need to give people from Heron Point, especially, more time to react to this and think about this. It was the notices in the paper, but I'm not certain. Well, I myself read the paper, but the notices just really catch my attention. This has become a popular issue, and I think we need to spend more time letting people talk about it.
Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Michelle Gamble, and I was here 2 years ago. I think I was the first person to submit a CUP application for the vacation rental, and I ended up withdrawing my application when I heard so much opposition to it. But I live in Heron Point now, and the first I heard about this hearing and this issue was a little over an hour ago, and I sent an email out to all of the residents in Heron Point at 5:58, and in the last, hour and what's it been? I don't know, almost 2 hours, I've received 14 responses from neighbors who said that they had no idea that this hearing was happening, and they had never heard that there was emergency shelters or any changes that would affect the Boeing property. And many of them have said that they would like to be heard on the issue. So I reiterate the comments of Rick Bennett that we would appreciate an opportunity to be heard, and that many people in Heron Point feel that way.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Joyce Parquet, Old Town, Seal Beach. Maybe you should consider tonight adding more list of people that surround all this, and instead of 500, is it 500 feet? Maybe you should just go and mail all into Heron Point. They have a right to know what's going on. And we're only talking about the one building, right? The emergency building?
At this point, yes, we are just
Where
talking
is that
about...
supposed to be? The same place where the houses are?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, it's on the Boeing
That's coming up
site.
next, the house.
It's on Boeing.
But I think that you ought to mail out to more people. The same thing happened, if you remember, to that microwave dish down there that nobody got a notice on, and that bothered me. And they finally decided they would send them to 500 people up to 500 feet up here. Anybody can go down and get a permit to build a microwave dish or emergency shelter without them notifying them. There's something wrong here. And there's something wrong with us having to put it all down close to us. And as far as develop a building, guess who's going to subsidize those low-income people? Taxpayers.
Anyone else have a comment? Was it a quarter-page ad in the Sun for the...
I don't recall.
If it's
City clerk is
citywide,
saying no.
if it's citywide, doesn't it have to be a quarter-page ad?
Not that I'm aware of, not by our municipal requirements.
Okay. All right. Any questions from the commission? What's your pleasure?
I'd like to follow.
One question, please.
Go ahead.
On the transitional housing, would that require a conditional use permit?
Madam Chair and Commissioners, no. State law precludes cities from requiring a CUP for transitional supportive housing unless a CUP were required for ordinary housing in that zone, which is typically not the case.
Thank you.
Who typically builds SROs in transitional housing?
My understanding, it's typically nonprofit agencies.
If there are no longer any redevelopment agencies to subsidize, have there been any SROs or transitional housing built within the last couple of years that was by a nonprofit that was able to afford to do that without subsidize?
My understanding is very few. There are other sources of funds besides redevelopment agency funds that could support those kinds of facilities. Grant programs either from the federal government or from the state, but the amount of funding is very limited.
Following Dr. Goldberg's questions, is there any reason why I couldn't change my home right now to transitional housing?
Well,
if I have a 3-bedroom home, could I open it up to, could it be a halfway house without conditional use permit?
You mean if this proposed ordinance were not adopted under current rules?
No, if this were adopted.
If this were adopted.
Could I make my house into a transitional house, if you will?
Yes, the city would be limited to regulating any more strictly if your home were a transitional facility as opposed to a conventional residential home. But as I said earlier, this would not change the law of group homes. So under today's regulations, even without this ordinance, you could operate your home as a care facility with up to 6 people in it, and that would be treated as a single-family use under today's rules.
So there's really no practical change from what we have today?
This would not change the rules of group homes, I don't believe.
No.
You can already do that under the existing law. You apply to the state, not to the city, because we already have 2 group homes in College Park East, 1 for senior citizens, 2 for senior citizens. We had a 3rd for, it was middle school boys. And you want to talk about problems, you can talk to the neighbors. But there wasn't anything anyone could do because they get their license from the state. And all the city can do is watch.
As long as it's 6 or less.
Mm-hmm. But I'm just saying, the law already exists for you to do that now. This will not have any impact on it.
I think that piggybacks into Mr. Caviola's question about is what we're doing tonight going to facilitate the possible placement of drug rehab facilities in Old Town, and I think the answer is no, because sober living type facilities are already permitted under our current code. Please correct me if I'm wrong. That's correct.
That's my understanding.
And a conditional use permit is not required now for that?
Not for 6 or less.
I'm not talking about group housing, I'm talking about transitional.
Oh, transitional.
Or sober living.
Sober
Well,
living.
sober, that's not
Sober living,
transitional.
drug
but
rehab.
That's not under the definition of transitional, is it?
No.
A sober rehab kind of facility?
That's right, they're separate things.
Yes, okay.
Mr. Barr, we don't have any options here?
Well, once again, see, and I have emphasized what the consultant is saying, the group homes, sober living is not being affected at all, or sober living or drug rehab places is not being affected by this proposed change on transitional housing. This is a different concept, and for transitional housing, we need to require for state law. So our hands are tied on this transitional housing. My firm's actually involved down in Newport because it's a big problem on sober homes. And they have developed different laws with respect to that, different regulations. That's something that the city may consider as a separate matter at some future date if it becomes a big problem. But for now, we're focusing just on transitional housing, and yes, state mandates require this.
Well, the question is, do we want to deal with it now, or are we going to deal with it later?
You mean sober home? You mean?
No, I'm dealing with our ordinance now.
Well, I'm comfortable with the notice that was provided. It was legally adequate. And I understand the concern that Heron Point, in terms of communities that are within the city, that's the closest one to some of these proposals.
Mm-hmm.
And so that may be something that you could direct to the city council or direct staff that at the next level expand it. And some of these people know this, and this was already mentioned before. I think maybe Jim, no, actually it was,
Mr. Buby?
yes. No.
No? Okay.
But it doesn't matter who said this. But state law only requires 300 feet. And we, as a city, expanded, well, the city council did this many years ago, maybe Patty was on the council, expanded it beyond to 500 feet because we wanted to provide additional notice. And so if you feel it's really important that before the city council, you can direct staff to expand that to the people in Heron Point, even though it's not legally required.
If we do nothing tonight, this thing is deemed approved, is that correct?
No, it goes to the council.
No, our action tonight.
It's a recommendation.
I know, but if we do nothing, then it's deemed that we have approved it. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. So we have to take some kind of action. Okay.
But that doesn't preclude us from continuing it for 2 weeks, I don't believe. Is that correct?
No, and we're under a tight schedule with respect to compliance with the last cycle. That's one of your options. I mean, we're recommending that you do take some action tonight. Because once again, you're just a recommending body, and the decision-making body is the city council. And for the people that want to influence the decision-makers, they'll have that opportunity at the city council.
That's my feeling, too. This is just kind of a precursor tonight. The real decision-maker will be the city council. So that's where you're going to have the strongest influence if you come to speak. And you'll have 2 opportunities, as Quinn mentioned, to do that.
That's correct.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but this particular amendment does not address Heron Point. It addresses
That's correct.
a municipal code amendment
Right.
only.
Heron Point is telling us that they weren't notified.
But they're the closest residential area in Seal Beach to the two locations we're discussing.
I understand that, but this is an amendment to change the municipal code to state, required by state law supposedly, to identify a zone where emergency shelters are permitted by right. It doesn't specify where that zone is. Right? We're just changing the amendment.
On page 8, it says emergency shelter. I'm looking at page 8. It says zoning conformance required. Emergency shelters may be established and operated in the Boeing specific plan district, subject to discretionary. So this ordinance does designate the Boeing specific plan as the area where the emergency shelters will be permitted, regulated, etc. But
if we strike that, can we go ahead with this? Municipal code change?
We're actually doing a couple things tonight. This first action is recognizing that area would be where the emergency shelters would be. And then we have another item, which is the next public hearing, to get into the specifics of the emergency shelters and changing the Boeing specific plan. And I don't want to jump into that too much, but the proposal right now is to allow multiple emergency shelters over the 102-acre campus there. And the Planning Commission, we can make recommendations regarding that, whether we want that many there or the whole Boeing campus, etc. But the actual decision about whether Boeing will be the site where emergency shelters are going to be, that was a decision made by the council. And that decision was made back in November, maybe even earlier than that. And this whole process, the housing element process, began almost 2 years ago. There was never any other alternative location ever suggested for the emergency shelters. And so for us, it's not really up to the Planning Commission to find another location for emergency shelters. There was never a list to choose from. There were never any alternatives put forward. I think the best that we can do is when we talk about how many emergency shelters are going to be there and where they're going to be on the building property, that I think we can make some real recommendations to the council. And on that issue, I think the residents should have a voice and be heard on that. But that's actually the next public hearing. I think it's very unfortunate that the residents weren't notified. I personally apologize. I'm your planning commissioner. I thought you would be notified. I thought you were in the 500 feet, so I'm going to take some personal responsibility for that. I do note that on the ad hoc committee, you do have a resident on the ad hoc committee. The ad hoc committee has been meeting on this for the past 2 years, and there's a Mr. Mike Papadopoulos, who I believe is a Heron Point resident. He was appointed. He actually took my place on the ad hoc committee in September 2011, and so it was that committee that recommended originally putting the shelters at Boeing. So it's kind of putting the shelter someplace else at this point is probably too late. That's not to say that there aren't some constructive things that this commission can do in terms of recommendations, and that's going to be part of the next hearing. But I tend to agree with the city attorney is regarding the placement of shelters at Boeing. The residents will have to really make their case before the council. The council could change the housing element and go someplace else. But I don't think we can put that decision off. And so this particular ordinance, I wouldn't continue what we have in front of us today for this public hearing, which is number 1 out of 4. This one, I don't think we need to put off particularly. The next one we'll talk about separately.
Okay, thank you.
I'm prepared to make a,
But I do have some other questions. There are a couple other comments from the public that I'd like to have staff address, particularly Mr. Eaker's comment. This is on page 6 of the ordinance regarding SROs. Mr. Eaker asked about the weekly basis, and I think that comment was very important. Do we have to allow occupancy on a weekly basis in SROs, or can we say monthly?
And it was a very good comment. And so depending on the direction of the commission, I'd like to consult with the consultant about that and see if that is compatible with our own ordinance and whether we can get rid of a weekly basis, but that's what we'll need to discuss. And it's certainly something. And there's also another issue that it may be possible that, and this is once again off the top of my head, that we could limit it to certain parts of the city, but that's what we need to talk about. But definitely on that weekly basis, we want to make sure that this is not inconsistent with our own ordinance, which, as you know, we do not allow vacation rentals at this point. It's just not permitted. Any type of renting for under 29 days. So we need to kind of reconcile those two concepts. If there is that direction, we'll consult with we'll raise this with the city council, and we'll talk to the consultant and see if we can remove that language.
Okay.
Other questions?
No.
Would you like to, it appears as one of the commissioners is ready to make a motion. Do you want to consult with our consultant? Shall we take a 5-minute recess?
It's up to you. I was thinking more in terms of after this motion, you can direct staff to explore that issue.
Okay.
Before it gets to the city council.
Is that acceptable?
Well, I can make a motion to recommend this ordinance with two changes. One would be to strike the weekly basis and make it monthly basis or longer. And then the other change would be on the next page, top page 7, is to strike the word hotels and put in the words units. So those would be the, essentially make a motion that we recommend that the council adopt this ordinance with those two suggested changes. Would be my motion.
If I may make a comment on that, Robert.
Can we have a second first?
I'll second.
Okay.
Right, discussion. Okay. As far as requiring people in transitional or emergency shelters to be there for a month, I don't know if that's something you want to require. This is not a vacation situation. This is a situation where you could have someone who is out of work, out of their house, and may need 1 or 2 weeks to redirect themselves. Maybe they don't need a whole month. And by putting that requirement of a month, you're throwing them into a different situation. I think the word emergency says a lot right there. And, you know, in that instance, I think maybe we need to review and discuss it more. I'm not willing to put a requirement of a month. If you've got an emergency shelter, what is generating the emergency? Have we had a disaster where people have homes that are damaged? Are we having an emergency shelter from people that are homeless because of the economy? Those are two different situations there. So, No, I'm talking about emergency shelters.
The question from Seth was SROs.
Okay, SROs.
Well, I doubt
The reference to weekly is in the SRO section,
Okay.
not in the emergency section.
Let's put an SRO where it is. It's a single-room occupancy meant for really short-term, although they say that you can't put a time limit on SRO occupancy.
Mm-hmm.
They can live there for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years.
That's not short-term.
It's not, well, no, it's not. But if you're concerned that an SRO, if it's on a weekly basis, is going to turn into something like vacation rental. The people who are running these SROs are not going to rent them for vacation rentals. They're going to be for people who are in need for temporary housing or even long-term housing. So I think you're confusing vacation rentals and SRO. It just doesn't compute.
Didn't I read somewhere where they're putting a 6-month limit on somebody to use either an SRO or emergency shelter?
I don't know.
Okay, I think I read something like that, but I could be mistaken.
Was that with the state or with the
No,
nonprofit?
that was in one of these documents, they set a limit. Is that
That's
6
the
months?
emergency.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's why, you're kind of squeezing somebody in that situation, but, no.
Call for the question. Okay. Call for the question. Please vote.
I'm sorry, what are we voting on?
We're voting on adopting this ordinance.
As
The resolution.
With two recommendations.
Changes.
With two recommended changes to the council.
Changing the word from hotel to unit.
The other one was taking out the word hotel and
Okay.
putting in the word unit.
I got it.
Okay, we've got 5.
Unit and monthly.
Yes. Okay, we've got a 5-0 adopting resolution ordinance. Wait, what's the
Doesn't really
resolution
have
number?
a
here,
number.
sir? Resolution 13-4. Okay.
I'd also like to make a motion that we direct staff to extend the notification on this particular item to the Heron Point development.
That's a good idea.
I'll second that.
I don't think we need to vote on it. I think the point is made.
Okay.
All right, item number 3 is specific plan amendment 13-2, amending the specific plan for Boeing Integrated Defense Systems regarding emergency shelters. Can we have a staff report, please?
Yes, Madam Chair, continuing on with the issue of emergency shelters, as Commissioner Goldberg correctly pointed out, the ordinance that you just recommended is to amend the municipal code. And in the municipal code, it makes reference to the development standards that would apply to emergency shelters, and also makes reference to the Boeing specific plan as the location within the city where they would be permitted subject to those development standards. This item is an amendment to the Boeing specific plan that specifically would allow emergency shelters as part of the regulations for the specific plan in 3 of the 4 planning areas within the specific plan. And I know there has been a question prior to the meeting tonight about where those planning areas are located and whether it is possible to limit the planning areas where emergency shelters would be permitted. So this is a map of the Boeing specific plan. There are 4 planning areas, as you can see. The draft ordinance to amend the specific plan that's in front of you tonight would allow the shelters to be located any place within planning areas 1, 2, and 3. So planning area 4 would be excluded from the option of emergency shelters. The amendment to the Boeing specific plan is fairly narrow because the municipal code amendment that you just discussed addressed the issues of development standards, and that would be, for example, the things we talked about previously, maximum size of 10 beds, separation of 300 feet between shelters, and the requirement for a management plan. some important things to keep in mind related to this amendment is that the permission of the property owner would be required. The city does not build emergency shelters. Private or nonprofit entities, those emergency shelters that are established, they're established by private or nonprofit. The property owner retains control of the property, and so no emergency shelter would be established unless the landowner were to lease or sell property within the project for that purpose. So that summarizes the essence of this specific plan amendment that is before you, and would be happy to entertain any questions you may have.
Are there any questions? I know Dr. Goldberg.
Well, I have some questions and clarifications. And on your slide here, you have 4 different things. You've got where they're going to be in Boeing, which is these planning areas 1, 2, and 3, maximum beds, separation, and management plan. One of the questions I had was which of these decisions are discretionary for us, and what you explained is that the minimum separation of 300 feet, that's not discretionary. We can't make that any wider.
That is correct. State law specifies that the maximum, the greatest separation that cities can require is 300 feet. That is, as you say, that is specified.
And then regarding the number of beds, you have a maximum of 10 beds, and actually, through the housing element, 10 is the minimum size that would comply with the state regulations. Is that correct, based on our assessment of how many homeless we have in town?
With regard to that standard, the minimum number of beds, there isn't anything specified in state law other than a general requirement that cities have to be able to accommodate their estimated homeless population. And so the limit of 10 beds was chosen because it is at the small end of the range that is typically being considered in cities in Orange County these days. I have seen a range anywhere from 10 up to 50 or more in different cities, depending on the nature of the city. So in cities where homeless people tend to congregate, such as Anaheim, Santa Ana, areas where there's more services for homeless people, they tend to allow larger shelters in order to accommodate that need. So it was a judgment on staff's part to recommend the limit of 10 because it's at the low end of the range.
And also our police department did an assessment, and it's their opinion that we have 10 plus or minus homeless people. And that was their professional opinion / assessment.
Yes.
And that's what's driving that number. Obviously, the management plan is a very good idea. So, from my perspective, the issue that I think that the commission can discuss and the public can assess or discuss is, do we have to have all of the planning areas 1, 2, and 3? That's a very large campus. It's 102 acres. Staff did give the planning commission a copy of the map, and we have a slide on that. But my question, and I want to hear from the public on this also, is couldn't we restrict the zone to just one of the planning areas? We're already saying that planning area 4 is not being considered, and that's where the current hotel is, and restaurants and Schwab and et cetera over there in planning area 4. So I think that's one of the things that we can hear from the public on, and I'll have some more comments later on, but I think that's where we have to focus our attention.
Well, Madam Chair, let me just address that question now instead of lingering with it. We can restrict it to one planning area. I would recommend that you select planning area 1.
And your reason?
Planning Area 1 is one of the largest parcel, or probably the largest parcel in the sense that's undeveloped. The other parcels, to a certain degree, have already been improved, especially Planning Area 3. And Planning Area 1 is that which is closest to Westminster Boulevard and has a great deal of flat top area.
The other advantage of that is it's closest to the bus stop, and I think that's one of the things that is an important part of locating a shelter, is that there be public transportation accessible.
That's correct.
Mr. Basham, and I guess it's also a question for our consultant also. If the council approves the municipal code change that we've already made, an individual could lease part of an existing building for an emergency shelter or build a new building. Is that either one would be permissible, correct?
Well, not really. It's going to be up to Boeing. Right. They own the property. So no one's going to do anything without their permission, and then they'll come to the city. So and it's not practical that they would lease one of the buildings. These buildings are large, very large. So, and they also were constructed in the early 60s. So trying to meet current building code requirements and fire code requirements will not happen with an existing building to lease.
Even leasing half of one floor or a quarter of one floor and
not one of Boeing's buildings, not with their employees in there. Good luck.
You're also converting an industrial or office use to residential, and the building code requirements would preclude that being feasible in those old buildings.
And you couldn't change an occupancy just by moving in with a different type of use.
It has to be the whole building, not just part of it.
And even though this is a specific plan, the various zoning law or the building codes would still apply, even if it's...
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any of the regulatory process that we approve tonight doesn't negate any state or building and safety requirements.
How is Planning Area 2 used right now?
I think there's a couple of
buildings. I believe there are a couple of buildings at that, in Planning Area 2. Planning Area 3 is practically built out with brand new research and development industrial buildings. The lower portion of Planning Area 1 encompasses the current occupancy of Boeing employees, and I think that's building 80, 81, and 90. And those are secured areas.
I think there's some open space in Planning Area 2. I think staff is going to maybe give us a Google map on that.
If I'm not mistaken, that's a controlled area of Boeing, and it's secured. So it's...
Planning Area 2?
Right.
Planning Area 2 is?
Right.
I think there's a fence all around there. You can't drive through that, or it's blocked off. I think it's more of kind of a utility area.
Yeah, that's a good one, yeah. This is Planning
Area 2. Area 2 is right here, I think, looking at the map.
So as you can see, the northern portion of Planning Area 1, where you see the gray asphalt area, that's underutilized parking area. That's the most feasible location where you can assess or study for any potential utilization of any shelter. Any other location probably would be impractical. So staff would recommend that the ordinance be changed as it goes before City Council with just the recommendation of Planning Area 1.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from commissioners? Okay, public. Mr. Eaker.
Good evening again. So addressing this public hearing again from the Chamber of Commerce perspective, so the Chamber would support staff's recommendation, particularly for Planning Area 1. In addition, I've realized the time I will not be able to most likely stay here, so I'm going to, if it's all right, Madam Chair, just address very briefly, since we've got the map up here, agenda item 4 for the zoning plan amendment for 1011 Seal Beach Boulevard with accurate storage. The comments of the chamber would be as following. It seems that there's a very limited amount of commercial and industrial space available within the city of Seal Beach. And the chamber would, again, generally support all of these recommendations, but would caution and ask the consideration of Planning Commission if we completely reduce or transform a light industrial or commercial use to a high-density residential. I think as the DWP property expansion or DWP project demonstrated, for a lot of people in the community, once it kind of gets to housing, it ain't ever coming back. It's gonna stay housing, and if it's high density in particular, it'll probably stay high density housing. So my concern from the chamber is merely that the industrial use be able to be preserved for the existing tenant, and I was a little unclear in the staff report if that would be able to be continued, that the existing tenant wouldn't effectively be zoned out of their property. I would assume not.
That's correct.
Okay, so as long as that's the case, then we have no further comment. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you.
Good evening, Madam Chair, Commission, staff. Mark Rupesco, resident of Old Town. I have a question, portion of my comment, and I might be at the wrong time, wrong place, but that's the story of my life. Probably to Quinn, but if the city was to deny all of these zone changes, what is then the state's penalty to the municipality? And in your knowledge of what's going on with all of this right now, have any municipalities told the state that we're not accepting your requirements? And what has happened there? Is it going to go to the state Supreme Court, or what are the financial penalties, et cetera? Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr.
Yes,
Attorney.
I'm not aware of any current litigation going on, and maybe John is, but I can tell you, historically, the two things that we're always concerned about in the housing element is a court could enjoin us from issuing building permits citywide. That's already happened to this city. Or two, there's certain funding that can be withheld. And so those are the two big concerns. About 20 years ago, a number of cities, which were bedroom communities that had large minimum lot sizes, that had absolutely no place to put any housing other than their 1 acre sites, basically told the state, we're not gonna do this. And the state came down pretty hard on them, and they weren't able to build any homes until they finally complied. So that's the biggest concern that we have.
Madam Chair, if I could jump on to that. I'm also not aware of any specific litigation on these issues right now, but we've talked about the certification of the housing element and the importance of that. State HCD has stated very bluntly that any city that does not implement these ordinances will not be eligible for certification of their 2013 housing element. And so, city has a certified housing element today. If these ordinances are not implemented as was called for in the housing element, then the housing element will fall out of compliance and the next housing element will not be certified.
So there. Wow. We can't just pick up the issue again and try and put it in our new housing element?
Not this time.
Okay. Any other questions from the public? Anyone else want to speak on this Boeing site?
Joyce Ross Parkey again. Why do we have to have more than one emergency building? If you're going to build triple buildings down there, they're going to come. They're going to come. And who's going to pay for all that? And not only are they going to come to our location down here, they're going to come to your location, even though you're fenced in, gated in. They're already jumping over your fence up there, aren't they? Why do we have to have, how many buildings do you want to build?
We have no number of buildings to be built.
I think we'll only stick to one, because if you build more than one, they're going to come. They're going to come to this location just like Long Beach used to drop them off over there. They put them on that red bus and said, get off at the bridge. And they came. We're going to all have the problem. You're going to have the problem, too, because it's going to be right up there by you.
Thank you.
Hello again. I'm not sure if I need to re-speak about this again.
Just your name, please.
Okay. My name is Rick Bennett, and I'm a resident of Seal Beach. I live in Heron Point. And being that this is a different agenda than what I prior spoke about, we've got the same arguments as to Heron Point residents. We're not notified of this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just found out a few minutes ago that this whole process was pushed out of Rossmore and pushed into Seal Beach. Can you guys expand on that?
Would staff like to talk about the site in Rossmore Shopping Center that was eliminated?
Madam Chair, to my understanding, there were a number of sites that were explored or studied. At the shops at Rossmore in the rear was one of the locations that was studied. It's to my understanding in November of 2012 when staff presented the studied areas to the City Council. There were directions that were given as to the appropriate locations to explore for each of these hearing items that are before you this evening. And for the emergency shelter, it was Boeing. And for accurate storage is for the potential to capture any additional housing needs.
Madam Chair, if I could just clarify, that Rossmore Shopping Center was never considered for emergency shelters. It was considered for the high-density housing, which is our next public hearing, which has to do with discussing whether it should, or how many homes or whatever on the accurate storage facility. But early in the process, as Mr. Basham was saying, there was a list of locations that were considered for both housing and emergency shelters, which included the Rossmore one. But the Rossmore one was discussed at length for housing. It was taken off the list by the council, but that was never considered for emergency shelters.
Dr. Goldberg, I noticed that you pointed at the accurate storage.
Yeah, and that's going to be our next public hearing.
Right.
We're not talking about that right now. That's the next one.
Exactly, but still, I still think we should have received the notice because that's well within 200 feet of Heron Point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public? Any other comments from the Planning Commission?
I'd like that staff was sort of supportive of limiting this to PA1. My concern still, and that's better than what we started with. For Heron Point here, we're right here for PA1, as opposed to what we started with, which was all the way down here. So on the original proposal, we could have had an emergency shelter here, and now it's a little bit farther away, perhaps. Regarding Ms. Parquet's point about multiple shelters, as we said, the state law says we can only require spacing at 300 feet. When I looked at this map on Google, I was trying to figure, there's no scale here, but when I looked at it, the length of this building here, that's about 300 feet. That's when I studied it. That's about 300 feet. So even if we go with PA1, you could put a facility here and another facility here. That's 2. And you could put a facility here. It's assuming they just go into parking lots based on what staff's telling us. So even in PA1, you could still have 3 facilities. We've always talked about needing 1 facility, so my question, I guess, I'm going to ask another question. Could we limit it within PA1 to 1 area or 1 sub-area of PA1? Would that be possible?
That would be counterproductive of what the state is asking for local jurisdictions to do. And it would not be 3, because, again, you're referring to one of the spots in a secured environment. That's not going to occur.
Which one is it?
In the lower portion of Planning Area 1, it will not occur. So what I referred to was on the northerly side of Planning Area 1, that's adjacent to the arterial. And what you're presenting is a hypothetical. You don't know if that will ever occur. And again, this would all have to be required first and approved by Boeing.
And I appreciate you don't have a pointer, but which areas of Planning Area 1 are secure? It's these these buildings right here, right?
Including the parking lot.
Which parking? This one here?
No, up next to Westminster.
This is all secure?
It's not secure, no.
No. So I'm just trying to understand where in Planning Area 1 besides these buildings. I understand they wouldn't go in the building.
Can you please bring up the planning area for me?
Along Westminster Boulevard, in the parking lot.
Okay, they couldn't put one down here in this parking lot?
No, that's a secured environment. Only the northern part adjacent to Westminster Boulevard.
Okay. Then they could put one here and one here, and then there theoretically could be 2.
Okay. And it depends. If Boeing needs parking, then no.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can argue theory with you all night. I mean,
well, I'm not arguing theory. We're making a municipal code change that's going to be permissive to allow that if that's what Boeing wants to do that.
And that's limited to Planning Area 1.
Right. Okay.
And if some point Boeing comes in to recycle their property, they may or may not take that into consideration when they revise a specific plan or bring us a development plan for the entire site. So I think they're going to keep their options open.
Mm-hmm. And by secure parking, do you mean that the public can't, the public's not allowed? Because I've driven up Apollo Drive is not a private driveway.
That's Boeing's employee parking area.
And this is not Boeing's parking? That's not true for the state?
That's surplus area.
Okay.
I wouldn't be recommending that to you, Commissioner Goldberg, if I didn't think that would be a practical location for you to locate.
Okay. Well, it's got to be practical, and I also, what you're saying is you're reassuring the residents of Heron Point, which is down here, that what we're really talking about is being permissive of an emergency shelter or 1 and possibly 2 up on Westminster Boulevard, which is as far away from Heron Point as we possibly could put them on this campus.
That's correct.
Okay.
Right across the street from Leisure World.
Yeah.
And 10 beds.
I'm trying to reassure Heron Point.
10 beds.
There's no representative from the...
We're planning a new wall along there that's going to be 10 feet high.
Yeah.
Who builds these shelters and operates these shelters, and what motivation does someone have to build a shelter?
No.
Commissioners, emergency shelters, as I understand it, are usually built by nonprofit agencies with a substantial amount of grant funding, either from government agencies or from private foundations. I'm not sure how many emergency shelters there are in Orange County, but I bet you can count them on 2 hands, maybe some toes. There just aren't very many, and because it is very difficult to fund them. The purpose of the state law that's driving this amendment was on the part of the state legislature to try to remove some of the constraints because there is a tremendous unmet need for homeless individuals. And so there's two ways you can do that. You can bring more money to the table, which is required, but also there was viewed an obstacle of land use regulations. And so this law was to address the side of the equation of land use regulations. The old saying, you can't push on a string, just because every city in Orange County amends its zoning ordinance to allow emergency shelters, still, it's pretty unlikely that they are going to be developed. That said, I can tell you my concern as your housing consultant is that when state HCD reviews local government's housing elements and their regulations on emergency shelters, they get out a very sharp pencil and look for any undue constraints on the possible development of emergency shelters. And so the more restrictive a city is, there isn't a bright line. I can't tell you, which planning area or what the minimum number of acres is within the allowable zone, but I can tell you that it's a gray area, and the more restrictive a city is, the more likely they are to run into problems with state HCD, either getting their housing element certified or maintaining it as certified. So we've already talked quite a bit tonight about the importance of having a certified housing element, and so my 2 cents worth is that the more restrictive the city is on this ordinance, the more likely we are to run into problems when HCD reviews the ordinance as part of our next housing element.
May I ask a question? I know we've already taken a vote on this, but Dr. Goldberg's comment about taking the amount of time the state, making it a minimum of 30 days, is that the kind of restriction that HCD would perhaps consider too restrictive?
There is no 30-day limit that's proposed as part of the emergency shelters ordinance. I know we were talking about weekly or monthly as part of the SRO ordinance, but the only time limit that is referenced in this emergency shelter language is language that comes out of state law for the definition of what is an emergency shelter, and typically it is it can limit a person from staying there to no more than 6 months out of any 1 year period.
Just at this point, you talk about getting restrictive. My concern is that something, was that something that would have been considered a red flag? Because, at this point, after all the work that's gone into it, I, really hate to see it get tossed out for something like that.
Yeah, and if I can interject, because I share your concern, and that's why when that change was made at the last public hearing, we still need to consult on that, to look at the 7-day compared to the 30-day. I mean, there are a lot of good reasons why people are not going to rent out these SROs as vacation rentals. It just doesn't make economic sense. But that's what we'll be looking at to see if it's a red flag for HCD, because that's so important to us, because as we all sit here today, the most important thing from my perspective and our consultant and our planning department is that we comply with the state law.
Any other questions? You look like you're waiting to, you're thinking to say
No, I don't have any more questions. I have a comment, but I don't have any more questions.
Okay. The pleasure of the commission?
I move the adoption or the recommendation to the City Council for the adoption of Resolution 13-5.
Is there a second?
I second.
Can you have a discussion?
Okay, would you like to discuss?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Commissioner Cummings, the resolution as it's written right now includes shelters in planning areas 1, 2, and 3. Can I, go ahead.
After the second comment about no red flags, I'm thinking maybe we should leave it up to the city council to limit that. That would give staff a chance to kind of look at that issue and make a recommendation to city council on that, to limit it to PA1 instead of PA1, 2, and 3, which is in the current one. I would prefer to leave it at 1, 2, and 3 at the present time, and then have the staff speak to city council about the implications of limiting it to just PA1.
I didn't really hear staff express, and I can't put words in their mouth, obviously, but I didn't hear them expressing strong concerns that limiting to PA1 was going to threaten.
The consultant said anything
that'll raise a red flag. I think it also gives Boeing the option of locating it in another place. I know that when you look at the actual site plan, there are buildings all over, and there may not be an opportunity, but let's leave it up to Boeing if they want to agree to sell a piece of property, to place it somewhere other than in PA1. Leave it up to them.
Well,
as long as it fits.
I feel strongly that it should only be PA1 for multiple reasons, including the proximity to Heron Point. And I mean, if the consensus of the commission is to go with a recommendation for all three, I then would put forth that we should continue this hearing and allow Heron Point residents to be here. If we just went with PA1, I'm okay with moving forward with that, because I'm trying to reassure them that it's mitigated and that the potential shelters would be as far away from their houses as possible. But if the commission wants to go with all three, my preference would be to continue and allow Heron Point to be here and per the residents.
My feeling is it's the same as the other issues. We're just making a recommendation. City council's going to make the decision, and these folks would have a lot more influence if they spoke directly to them.
I would just like, I mean, personally, I would like to have us make the recommendation that it be PA1. If staff can research that and give the council the pros and cons of that, a consultant can give the pros and cons of that. But I think we need to go on record as saying that, having, one or two up here is all we want, and we don't want one here and one here and one here and one here and one here. Because if you have the whole area here, only 6 to 8 of them could possibly
putting
be
10 beds in. I don't think you're going to scatter them all over a piece of property, but that might change too.
All right,
I actually concur with Dr. Goldberg on this. I thought we were voting on just the restricted area PA1.
No, we weren't.
No. Okay, we have a motion and a second.
I would like to...
Can I ask Quinn, again, a red flag? If we narrow this to planning area 1 and not and take 2 and 3 out of the equation, is that a red flag?
That's a question I would defer to John on, but I understand, both the current motion on the floor and the suggestion by Councilmember Goldberg. Either way, if it's really the wishes of the commission to go with just planning area number 1, if we decide that that's really a red flag, we'll tell the council. And so it's really pick what you think is best, with the understanding, just like with the SROs, that staff may come back with a different recommendation. And so whatever you feel is best, either one or go with the motion. Either one's okay with us at this stage. But you do have a motion on the floor, and so either way, the council is going to know that at least 2 commissioners have said they would prefer just 1, and it's just a question of what the other 3 want to do.
Okay.
Should we go ahead and vote?
Let's take a vote.
We need another second, because I'm retracting my second.
You're withdrawing your second?
Withdrawing it.
Okay.
If we're going to go with all 3.
Okay. All right, is there a second to the motion then?
I'll second only because, again, I agree with Esther. This is a recommendation. It'll be vetted again with staff and council. It can turn 180 degrees. At this point, we just need to make a decision, because if we don't, it'll be deemed approved.
But we could go ahead and make a recommendation with PA1, and they could reverse that to include all three areas if they like.
We
They could
can.
look the other way as well.
Again, my concern is the red flag, and again, you know, we're just a recommending body.
The council is aware of that red flag.
They
The
will be.
council will be aware of
Oh,
that.
yeah.
Staff have a
potential
month
red
to
flag.
research that.
Okay, let's vote. 3-2 passes with planning areas 1, 2, and 3 in it. And, Mr. Basham, I'm sure you will express the minority opinion to the city council in your staff report.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Next item on the agenda is General Plan Amendment 13-3, and amendment to zoning map 13-4 at 1011 Seal Beach Boulevard for accurate storage. Before we get started, can we take a 10-minute break, please?
You get to decide.
We're taking a 10-minute break.
Now that should be my theme song. And that is the group called Organissimo, and this is from their latest album. This tune is called Up in the Playroom, right here at 88.1 with BWB. We just know how to do it. These cats have really brought back that organ groove, in the sense that they bring that organ, that Hammond B, along with that funky R&B sound that just makes it just right. It's a nice mix. Kind of gets you going, I'm feeling this. Yeah, okay. Anyway, we like that. That wraps up a nice long set. Ramsey Lewis slipping into darkness. And don't forget, this coming Sunday night from 9 to midnight, Ramsey Lewis will be in the house with his Legends of Jazz. You don't want to miss out on that. Ray Barretto before that, Summertime, from his album Carnival. Now, that is one of the albums that normally goes for $88 here when we have a membership drive. But since this is Jazz Appreciation Month, you can get that with your pledge of $40. Go online, jazzandblues.org. It's a great time to become a member of the family. Currently, right now, in Irvine, it's mostly cloudy and 59 degrees. Here's Chet Baker. He is coming up next, right here on K-Jazz.
The jazz landscape is remarkable. Duke, Train, Ella, Miles, Mongo, plus all points that swing in between. Hello, this is David Benoit. Join me mornings starting at 6 a.m. You'll hear these great artists and quite a few others on K-Jazz 88.1.
Call the meeting back to order. Please have a seat. And we introduce the zoning map amendment and the general plan amendment for the accurate storage site. Can we have a staff report, please?
Madam Chair, Commissioners, again, this is a code amendment that was called for in the housing element that was adopted by the council about a year ago. The background of this item is that in the previous housing element cycle, the city was not able to demonstrate that it had enough sites for high-density housing to meet its fair share need. And so in order to obtain certification of the housing element, the city was required to commit to adopting one or more zone changes that would create additional high-density zoning to meet the minimum requirement. Those members that were involved in the process last time recall that we had a shortfall of 19 high-density housing units. And so the requirement was for the city to identify a site or sites that could accommodate at least 19 housing units. There was a lengthy vetting process that went through the ad hoc committee, the Planning Commission, the City Council, reviewing a variety of sites. There were some references earlier in the evening that early in the process, the Shops at Rossmore Center was identified as a likely candidate, and then that site dropped off the list through the process, through the public hearing process, and last November, what the City Council initiated or directed staff to initiate the process to amend the general plan and zoning for the accurate storage property in order to satisfy the requirement that sets forth in the housing element. And so the item that's before you tonight is to amend the general plan land use designation from light industrial to high density residential, and also to amend the zoning map, the same change. So that is the background of this amendment that's before you. The details, many of you in the audience are very familiar with the former Accurate Metals, now Accurate Storage property. The site is about 4.5 acres in size. An environmental review was done for the general plan amendment and zone change, and a mitigated negative declaration was posted for the project. The project that was evaluated in the environmental review was for the maximum development that could occur if the general plan and zoning is adopted, and that is 90 residential units, which is derived from the 4.5 acres times 20 units per acre, which is the maximum density that's allowed in the RHD zone. And so the question before you is whether to recommend to the council the adoption of the general plan amendment and zone change to change the designation for the property. Now, this, as you know, this is not a vacant site. There is a going concern on the property. So a question comes up in this case, what about the existing business and the existing structure? The city's municipal code contains a provision regarding nonconforming uses, and so under the municipal code, the existing business would be allowed to continue indefinitely. So this zone change would not require the property to be redeveloped for residential. It would not require the owner to stop using the property for its current use. It would simply allow the future development of the property, if the owner so chooses, to redevelop the property subject to the new regulations that would allow residential on the site. There are questions that have come up in the last couple of weeks regarding a variety of issues such as traffic impacts. There was a traffic study that was done for the project, and that's attached to the initial study that was prepared. The traffic study concluded that if the project were developed at the maximum 90 units, that there would be no significant impacts to traffic according to the standards that the city uses to measure traffic impacts. There were a number of mitigation measures that were recommended for the project that are the standard types of mitigation measures that you always see for new development projects dealing with cultural resources and water quality and air quality and so forth. And so all of those mitigation measures would be attached to the project if it were to go forward. And so with that, I will close my presentation, and I know that there are a number of questions out there, so we'd be happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Okay. So we start with the commissioners. Do you have any questions of staff?
Not yet.
Not yet? Not yet? Okay. Let's open the public hearing. Mr. Caviola.
Yes, thank you for this lovely opportunity. If you don't feel that you can do anything, and we're just going to do whatever these guys say to do, then we should just not even be here. But on this, you can do something. I think it's questionable on the other, but you could easily put this in that parking lot that's empty. This is such an inappropriate use, non-compatible. We've got the dog shelter, we've got the police with the arresting things with the public yard there. And I passed out to you the 2008 Seal Beach Sun article, where I think most of you were on this commission then.
No.
Well, your name is in there.
Only my name. I think I'm the only one.
You weren't, yeah, okay. You turned it down for 87 units, for good reasons. Then in 2011, I have the staff document that says the staff recommends taking this site off the list of recommended places. Now here we are in 2013, the staff's recommending it. So we have a real problem that we have lack of stability in thinking, because that's not what planning is. Planning was moving the police department from next door to here to there. Planning was putting the dog pound there, and the city yard from Bridgeport to there, because that's a use, it's a utility. We do need utility places. Now to put residences in there, and we need 19, so we're going to do 90, okay? And this, this traffic doesn't matter thing, I mean, who isn't tired of that? These guys just make a living saying that. There's 180 cars are going to show up on that street, and it's not going to make a difference. As you know, we can't even go through Los Alamitos anymore. I avoid that like the plague. I used to like to go up to the auto parts store up there, but forget it. It's out of control. And now we're going to put 90 units when we turn down 87 because we need 19. It's not, people criticize government for things like this. This is what they do. They go, you need 19, so we're going to put 90. And then you wreck the plans that the forefathers made for that area. Now, what a belligerent thing to not notify these Heron Point and tell them that, oh, you didn't read it in the paper. Do you know how much those people paid for those houses? A lot.
It doesn't matter. Everyone paid something for their home.
Well, it matters when you pay the property tax.
All deserve a notice.
Good. That's what we agree with. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Doesn't not just because they're inherent.
Right. Well, they deserve, something. Okay, thanks. We agree on that. So thank you.
Good evening again, Mark Lupesco, Madam Chair, Commission, staff. This is not the right place. And to say that the owner of the property is not going to probably do anything. 5 years ago, he applied to rezone to build 3-story condos there. He's going to jump on this. He'll tell all the RV owners to move their cars tomorrow. He's going to build. We have a police station directly across the street. They don't want the traffic and the cars from 90 condos. We have a beautiful family shelter right down the street. They don't want the people living right there. The dogs don't want to see all those people. Come on. And the cats, yeah, they don't want the people there either. Put this back on planning area 1 up there at Boeing. Wrong place, wrong time. And yes, Patty, you can send a red flag on this one. Let's vote it down. Send a notice to Ellery and the commission, the council. She turned it down 5 years ago. We're going to hold her to it this time again, too. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Good evening again, Mike Beauty. Thank you for the opportunity. It's just absurd that if we need 19 units, we're going to zone for 90, and I would bet that you multiply out the land value, 20 units per acre. Whoever owns this property has a tremendous opportunity to make a ton of money, and we're not going to have a storage area. We're going to have 90 low-income units, and I don't think we need that. I don't think we want that many. It's time to say no.
Joyce Park area. Who put that storage container place there back on the map there? Somebody had to do it. If it was not on there for the last 5 years, did you put it back on there? The planning commission?
The city council put it.
The city council put it back on there?
Yes.
At whose request?
But the city council has the prerogative to do what it wants.
Well, I don't know about that. I'll ask them. Who put it back on there? Because right now, a grant is federal tax money that we, the taxpayers, send to Washington. A grant money is taxpayer money that we send to Sacramento. And then we have to have a grant, a charity come back here. Well, I don't know if you're aware, but San Francisco is already approved 200 square foot apartments. So if you go through with this deal, since he's already applied to have houses built there, we're going to have 200 square foot apartments up there, 90 of them. You watch it. San Francisco already has it. There should be another area in town where we could put it, like the private tennis court. Why don't we tear it down instead of putting $2 million into something that's not paying for itself? Let's put it back on there. That's what I'll tell the city council. Put the private tennis court back on, to tear that down and build them up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Michelle Gamble. I live in Heron Point. In fact, I can see my house about 3 inches from the red box that you have on the screen there. No one in Heron Point received notice, again, of this measure. And unlike the Boeing property, where it may be unlikely that it's ever going to be developed, it's very clear that this property will be developed. Anyone with any financial background can look at it and say a storage facility versus 90 residential units, that's a no-brainer. They're going to jump on this and develop it. And we haven't had an opportunity, anyone that lives in the 64 homes in Heron Point, to my knowledge, and many of them have responded to my email sent a few hours ago saying that they received no notice, to look at the studies. So we're hearing you say that there's going to be no parking impact, but we haven't had a chance to look at it. It seems really unfathomable that there's going to be 90 residential units with no parking impact. There's got to be some other impacts that I think that our community should have an opportunity to review before the Planning Commission makes a decision or a recommendation. And I realize that you're saying that the Planning Commission, we just make a recommendation to the council, but that recommendation has to be worth something, or you wouldn't give up your precious time to sit here and listen to this and make a recommendation. So I think it's important that the residents of Heron Point be given an opportunity to voice their concerns if there are any, and maybe there aren't any, and they're all going to show up and say, oh, this is great, we love it. More people, the better in Seal Beach. But I think they need an opportunity to do that so that the Planning Commission can reflect the voice of the people of Seal Beach and not say, hey, we gave the minimum required notice. Is that who we are as a city? We give the minimum required notice and then just squeeze a recommendation through? Or do you really want to hear from the people?
Thank you. Anyone else like to comment?
I'm Alicia Patterson. I'm here from Rutan and Tucker on behalf of the owner of the property. And I think what I have to say is maybe a little bit surprising. I had sent a letter before. I don't know if you guys...
We all read it.
You did? Okay. I'm not going to go through every point in my letter. It's already kind of a late night. But what I wanted to talk about was that, contrary to what I think a lot of people think tonight, the owner of this property was actually pretty upset when he found out that it was being considered to be rezoned to residential. The previous gentleman talked about how in 2008 he tried to get the property rezoned, and the Planning Commission voted 5-0 to turn it down. After that, he developed his property for industrial uses, and then 5 years later he found out that now the Planning Commission or the city is considering rezoning it to residential again. He's willing to support the rezone, but only on the condition that the city also adopts item number 5, which is a municipal code amendment that allows him to continue using his property for resident or for industrial uses. And
That's
also,
the next item on the agenda.
it is. Is it okay if we talk about it? Because once you approve this, it's...
No, they're separate,
Okay.
because we don't have to approve either one of them.
Yep. I just want to underscore that the owner's support for this rezone is conditioned on the city also approving the municipal code amendment that's next.
Okay. Thank you very much. Anyone else? I know that I was the only one, I'm the institutional memory, Quinn and Mr. Oliveira, the institutional memory of the previous residential proposal on this site. And I can tell you that the 83 or 87 units that was proposed would never have, if it was approved, never would have been that many. And the estimated price when it was going to be sold was somewhere in the range of $700,000, and that was in 2008. So while we provide the zoning for high density, we're not providing any subsidy for affordable housing. So if someone comes in here, they could very well build $700,000 or $1 million condominiums on the site. So keep that in mind. I'm going to take my turn.
You can't do that.
In terms of traffic, the number of cars being generated by a future development of this parcel will be in the same range as the traffic that was generated by Heron Point when it was constructed. So whatever comes out of Heron Point will come out of this development. I don't think that there's an overwhelming number of cars that would be generated if this piece of property were developed as residential. I'm going to throw a little sucker punch here. I personally believe that a better location for this housing is in Rossmore, in the parking lot, in the original proposed site. I'm not adverse to this piece of property being considered, but I think a better site is the one at the Shops at Rossmore. And I will stand by that forever until this is finished. Those are my comments at this point. Commissioner Goldberg?
I said before that this building, the length of this building is about 300 feet. And if you can visually look at that length versus that edge, I think it includes some of these houses here. And I appreciate that staff made an effort to notify, but I'm hearing that no one got notified in Heron Point. So I'd like to make a motion that we continue this to the next council.
Before that motion is made, allow staff to interject. The radius points that did encompass Heron Point were not obviously all the single-family homes out there. It was the ones that are closest, to my understanding, to the end of the cul-de-sac. So I wouldn't, for the public record, make a determination of a motion to continue it based upon something for which you're not sure.
Well, I asked staff earlier whether you could tell me for sure whether you had notified those homes, and I didn't get an affirmative answer to that.
Well, that was the first item, Commissioner Goldberg. Since then, I have checked with my staff.
Okay.
So it appears that there were a few homes at the end of the cul-de-sac that did receive a notice.
That's correct.
Okay. They just didn't tell anybody.
I appreciate that, and I will take that as a I'll stipulate to that, because I believe staff, of course. But I still feel that this is a very important development here. This is, we're talking about 90 homes here being considered. Heron Point is only 64, so this is 50% larger development in terms of homes than Heron Point. In terms of its acreage, it's 4.5 acres, which is the size of the development at DWP. We're talking about maybe 160 to 280 people, which is increasing the population of Seal Beach by 1%. And I think this community here, we've heard from several members of the community that they, for whatever reason, they weren't aware of it, and maybe that's their fault. But be that as it may, I think that this process and the proper vetting of this process just really warrants that we give them an opportunity to be here. And I'm not saying put it off for a month. You can put it off to the next meeting, and they're going to have to do a lot of work really fast. But that's what they're asking, and I would support them in that. I didn't support them regarding the emergency shelter issue. This one, I would support them on this. So again, I would like to make a motion that we continue the public hearing for the next meeting on this issue.
Could we have a little more discussion on this before we vote on
Right
that?
ahead.
I'd like to make some comments.
There was no motion.
There.
We're discussing.
Go ahead, Patty.
I'd like to make some comments. I think one of the reasons why the shops at Rossmore was taken off is that there is existing high-density housing there, and there is currently inadequate parking for the existing housing, and they are using the parking lot where they wanted to put the new housing, so you wouldn't have any, parking at all. The residents in the existing housing...
They'll have to walk a little farther.
No, the residents of the existing housing are already parking in the community of Rossmore, and the residents up there are not happy. So there's just, it's just, you're parking, the site that was picked was a parking lot that is currently used as an overflow lot for existing high-density housing, and it's totally inadequate.
Well, that's not its purpose, though. Its purpose is overflow parking for the commercial
area,
not for the residential
area.
Well,
but the residents are using it as overflow.
That may be the actual fact.
And that becomes a problem there in that they're now parking in the community of Rossmore, and that becomes a problem. And this, unfortunately, is out on a major street. I think the bottom line is nobody wants any of this. And unfortunately, we're mandated by the state to provide something, and if we don't, the state gets very stinky. And then they turn around and become punitive. And the other issue is, none of this has to be built. So we're really, how do we weave our way in and out of all of this? That becomes dicey.
Commissioner Sloan, did you have something else?
Yes, I did. Thank you. Mr. Caviola brought up a couple points that resonate with me a little bit. Was planning area A considered in the Boeing specific plans?
Planning area A.
Planning area.
I'm sorry. Did I get that right? Planning area A, planning area 1.
I think he means...
Planning area 1.
You're talking about planning area 1. That's on the Boeing site. Oh, you're looking at moving the units to the parking lot.
Yes, I'm asking staff if planning area 1 of the Boeing site was considered for rezoning rather than accurate storage.
Chair and Commissioners, yes, the Boeing property was on the long list from the very beginning, and that list was vetted, and as we mentioned previously, the City Council last November directed us to move forward with rezoning of the accurate storage property.
And there was no rationale given to that?
It was a policy decision on the part of the Council.
Mr. Caviola also brought up, and I think others, why we are rezoning 4.5 acres when we really only need 1 acre.
Yes, and the list of sites that went through the vetting process included sites of varying sizes. And so even though the minimum was about 1 acre, none of the sites were that small, and so the decision that the council made was to move forward with the accurate storage. If there had been a smaller site, the outcome may have been different, but again, the direction from the council was to move forward with zoning this site. It is a single parcel, and so...
So it would have to be subdivided? If we were to rezone
it would have to be subdivided.
And what is the downside of that?
Well, the downside is that the city does not have the authority to subdivide private property. The city's only authority is over the general plan land use and zoning designation. It would be up to the property owner to initiate a subdivision, unless under the option of condemnation, which this doesn't qualify for.
That's right. We don't have the power. Well, even our redevelopment agency, when we had one, did not have the power to acquire a residential property.
Can I comment on that? The other logical location, if you're looking for a smaller site, is the parking lot at the shops at Rossmore. You can carve out, I know it sounds funny, but you can carve out enough land there, an acre in size, and put the 20 units, which is less dense than all of the other multiple units that are already developed around that parking lot. So there are less units per acre of what we're proposing than what's already there. And as I pointed out at one of the hearings many moons ago when we were looking at potential sites, that parking lot is zoned commercial. And if the people around there understood that and understood that they could put a doctor's office on 1 acre of that parking lot, they would have more traffic going in and out of there than 20 units of residential would ever generate. So there's a lot of logical reasons why 1 acre in the parking lot at Rossmore Shops is much more logical than accurate storage, because what you have to do with accurate storage is take the whole 4.5 acres. And you don't want that. We don't need that much. But you have to take it because that's the size of the piece of property. Anyway, I don't know if I got that right, but...
No, actually, you are correct. The only issue, well, the main issue here, though, is that property was considered and was taken off the list, and what we have now is a certified housing element, which has this property, and John mentioned this not tonight, but at that time, when he was bringing back drafts to HCD, they told him, that's probably the best site. We really think that could happen.
The shops at Rossmore?
No.
Oh,
this
accurate
site.
storage?
Yes.
Okay.
And so that's not before you tonight, the shops at Rossmore.
No, but it's an alternative.
Yes, if we were to change at this point, we would never we would not be in compliance with our housing element, because it's off the list. It would not be compliant with our housing element.
But what is on the list is that PA1, the parking lot on Boeing, that is on the list.
Well, a portion of Boeing, I'm not sure if it's actually PA1, but
not
yes,
the whole.
Boeing was part of the...
Right.
So we ended up with 4 on our list, and then they came back and said, I think, 3, and John's looking for that to confirm.
Yeah, they didn't like Sunset Aquatic Park because it was owned by a government agency, and I can't think of the other one.
Marina Park.
Marina Park.
Marina Park.
Right. But the Boeing parking lot that's adjacent to Westminster is on the short list of 3 in our approved plan, so the council could change their mind and go with the Boeing parking lot and still be consistent with the housing element that's approved. To get back to your question.
That's correct. Yeah, they could
that's an option. The shops at Rossmore is not on the approved list, and so that's a horse of a different color at this point in time. Madam Chair?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I made a motion. I don't know, could you call for a second for my motion?
What's your motion?
My motion was to continue this to our next meeting so that we could have a full representation from residents at Heron Point.
I will not be here at the next meeting.
Is there a second? Hearing no second, motion fails. I think that I didn't close the public hearing. Is there objection to? Okay.
Thank you.
Please come on.
He has not been given a notice.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
Sir, with all due respect, I'd be more concerned about living right over the police exercise yard.
All right, that has nothing to do with this, but do we have a motion, or do we have other questions?
Well,
I'm going to close it. Wait, I'm going to close the public hearing. Okay. Now, no more audience.
I'm not considered public.
No, you're not.
Dr. Goldberg, could you tell me why you want to postpone this? Why not direct the staff to relook using the what's it called? Planning area 1 at Boeing?
Well, the purpose of my motion was to allow the residents to have their voices heard before us, so we can understand what their concerns are and have them review this as we're reviewing it. If the other option, I mean, the Planning Commission can vote no on this and send a message to the council that we think this is not a good choice, that the alternative of the Boeing parking lot should be looked at. And I would support that motion if the Planning Commission wants to make that motion. Short of that, I think you need to hear from the residents.
You think they'd have the same objections if we approved an area in the planning area 1?
I think they'd much prefer Boeing parking lot to the average storage.
I'm sorry, it's getting late, I guess.
Oh, it's early.
Yeah.
Could the staff tell me again why planning area 1 was rejected? Was it simply because of the council? There was no rationale, no reason for rejecting planning area 1?
My memory is a little fuzzy on the discussion at that meeting, but I think it's fair to say that the decision-making process was aired out quite a bit. It was a lengthy process, and ultimately, as we've said, it was the council's decision to move forward with this site.
And if I could just elaborate on that, the Boeing parking lot was not rejected. It's still on the list. But when the council gave priority to staff to begin the environmental review of one of the sites that were on the approved list, they did choose this site.
Accurate storage.
And so it's not rejected, it's just they gave that one priority. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. I mean, one of the reasons is because we're under the gun in terms of the end of the cycle. And there was some prior environmental review of that property. There could be a lot of other reasons why they picked that, but they did consider other alternatives, and that was the one that they chose.
And those studies wouldn't be transferable to the parking lot section right next door, for instance, or on Westminster? We'd have to redo it.
You have to do a separate environmental review of that, because it's a different property.
A comprehensive one.
Right.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
if I may have the floor, to answer Commissioner Sloan's question, I can read better than I can remember. The decision was made on November 13th, 2012 by the council. It was not discussed. It was on a consent calendar item. It was not pulled. And the rationale that's given in the report is that the consultant and city staff has reviewed the options of the 3 sites and believed that this site, the Akron storage site, is superior to the other 2 sites for a designation that would allow for by right multifamily housing. That's it. There wasn't any other explanation given to the public.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? We just took a motion to allow the shelters on the different planning areas. Can you vote to put the this housing on the same area?
Yes.
Since you've already put that on, and Quinn, since we already put the shelters on there, can you put the housing on that too?
I think there's a room, in fact, since it's on the housing element, for both the shelter and also a potential site for residential. The answer is yes.
Okay.
In order for us to continue considering then relocating from the Accurate storage site to the planning area 1, wouldn't we need to have a negative deck done that would evaluate that environmental?
Yes, and tonight the best you can do is, take a vote on the proposed site, Accurate storage, and see how the vote ends up. And then you could also have a second motion to say you'd like the city council to consider Boeing, for instance. But yes, we would have to do the environmental review, and that's going to take some time, and that's really going to put us under the gun. And that's just something that, the council may decide when this comes before them that may be something that they want to direct us to do. So it's within your jurisdiction to make that additional recommendation if you like.
So the motion would include relocating the 20 units to planning area 1 and preparing a negative declaration.
Well, that goes hand in hand. It would have to be done regardless of what
What gun are we under? What's our deadline? What?
John can tell you.
The deadline, this may sound backwards, but the deadline for the next housing element to be adopted is October 15th.
Right.
So we're working backward from that because we have to have our actions completed for the previous housing element before
October 15th.
The new housing element is due. So again, it's one of those issues where the closer we get to the deadline, the more scrutiny we get from the state. Our desire is to have these code amendments completed and in effect by the summer at the latest. So, here we are in early April, and it would take some time to redo the analysis, and then there's a 30-day public review period, and there's an agendizing and noticing period for subsequent planning commission and city council. So if we were to switch horses right now, it would put us in a little bit of a difficult situation.
Okay, opposite that, what if we considered Accurate storage and the motion was to take it off the map? And as considered site for 20 units?
To take Accurate storage off the list of options?
Yeah.
And move forward with Boeing?
Well, you have to do that, though.
So here's,
we're under the gun.
We don't have an option.
Madam Chair, another item in the list of things that we would have to do is, if there were any, I was going to say, in order to take something off the map, we would have to amend the housing element that we have that's in compliance now. So I would advise against that course of action. because it would require a change to the housing element, and then you have to go through the review by the state and relitigate the whole issue.
Never mind.
Actually, Madam Chair, the options you have is either vote to approve or deny it. But like you've done with the previous items, you can direct staff to ask City Council to consider Planning Area 1 as an alternative or the recommendation for the most appropriate site.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I do have some questions, a couple questions now.
Go ahead.
Regarding the zoning here, is there any way to creatively and legally zone this so that only 1 acre or acre and a fraction be allowed to be used for housing, and at the same time respecting the owner so the owner can keep it industrial if they wish, and we would still perhaps approve their suggestion regarding flexibility to change the industry that's there. But, with overlay zones or plan unit development, and I don't know zoning at all, but is it totally impossible to do this, or is it just difficult to do this, where we only have 1 acre developed?
You have a property that's zoned industrial, which means that they can put a different type of intensified uses. Staff cannot support rezoning half of a parcel or 1/3 of a parcel for residential, which is a sensitive land use adjacent to a high intensive use, because I don't know the possibility of what can occur on the remaining portion of that parcel that's zoned for industrial if for some reason the indoor and outdoor storage facility goes away and only 1 acre is developed with residential. And again, it doesn't have to be high density residential, meaning that somebody doesn't have to build condominiums. When you zone a property that's residential high density, in this case 20 dwellings to an acre, somebody can take the 4.5 acres that's there and make them detached single family homes. It doesn't have to be conceptually the idea of it being high density.
If I could just add on to that, Commissioners, an overlay zone basically is an option that sits on top of another zone, and state law and HCD explicitly prohibit an overlay zone in this situation where the city is required to rezone in order to comply with its fair share housing needs. So that, we've thought about that, but the overlay zone is just not an option because of the provisions of state law.
Okay, so it really from a state law perspective, and I appreciate planning director's perspective from a planning director, but even from a state law point of view, we can't. It's either going to be all or none for this site. That's fairly clear from what you're saying.
Yeah, if the property owner were to approach the city to initiate a subdivision, and request that a portion of it be residential and a portion of it be light industrial, then the city could process that request. But as we discussed previously, the city can't initiate a subdivision of the site.
Does that apply to Planning Area 1 as well? Would we have to rezone the entire Planning Area 1 residential?
That's a little different because that's a specific plan. And so it's not, when you change, let's call it the zoning of a specific plan, you're changing the permitted uses within that specific plan. And so you would not necessarily need a subdivision to accomplish that. You could add, in a Planning Area 1, you could add as a permitted use to residential.
Could you limit that to 1 acre?
I don't know if that'd be enough. That probably would create having to amend it even further to have new planning areas, if you know what I'm saying. So in other words, Planning Area 1 is that big area up there. the simple solution, and once again, this would have to go through environmental review, and it's not before you tonight, so you could make that recommendation to the council, but you just did planning area 1, then we could look at that and look at the environmental impacts, and that's easier and would not require a subdivision.
But not necessarily limited to 1 or 2 acres.
I don't know how big planning area number 1 is, but it's more than 1 acre. And that may create, once again,
41
sub-planning areas.
41 acres.
41 acres, yeah.
I'm sorry.
So it gets it is a complicated concept, but
one of the problems with the accurate storage area is it's 4 acres and 4.5 acres, and we only need on the order of 1 acre.
Right.
Right?
Right.
If we could solve that problem, then most of this issue would go away. But we can't, apparently, without a subdivision and the owner's approval and so forth.
And he's not going to get it.
And he probably wouldn't pursue that.
Made his position very clear.
Are we jumping out of the frying pan into the fire by proposing planning area 1 and having to rezone the entire area residential and face the possibility of that entire section becoming affordable housing? Is my question, and I'm not sure I understand the answer. If we could limit affordable housing in planning area 1 to an acre or 2, that might help solve this issue.
Well, I heard that you'd have to create a new planning area 5. That would be 1 acre.
That's what
Right.
I mean, off the top of my head, I haven't given any thought to just 1 acre. The beauty of the specific plan is you've got planning areas, and so you can treat them as distinct areas.
We need to amend the Boeing specific plan to, say, create a planning area 5 of 1 acre residential. Would we need Boeing's permission on that, or is that something the city could impose?
You would need Boeing participation in this process.
What about just changing the uses permitted in planning area 1? Include residential up to 20 units.
Well, that's what we're exploring.
And if I could weigh in on that, it's a similar situation to the overlay zone. State law says that actually at least half of that 19 units has to be in a zoning district that only residential is allowed. So if we were to add it as an additional permitted use, then that would run afoul of state law.
But that's what we're doing. Well, we'll get to the next public hearing, because I think that's what we're doing in the next public hearing.
No, what's before you is to change the zoning designation to RHD. Now, what's on the site today would become a non-conforming use and subject to the grandfathering and non-conforming use provisions, but the zoning would be okay as far as state law goes.
There is a possibility of exploring the subject property for high-density residential and also low-density residential.
Accurate storage for both?
Yes.
Well, that's a given, isn't it?
No, because the ordinance would be written whereby capturing only that which is necessary to satisfy the regional housing needs quantity, and the remaining portions of the site would be zoned for single-family residential or low-density residential.
But when you have to subdivide the parcel again to do that?
Yes.
And we can't initiate a subdivision of the parcel.
But we can say if the developer comes in, then he would have to provide us with the entitlements of showing the compliance with the ordinance. It's not bad planning in that if it's the entire parcel, because you don't have an incompatible land use next to a sensitive receptor. It's different. You're blending the two. You don't have opposites.
What would the low density be?
I believe it's residential, low density, 9 units to the acre is what our single-family standards are.
9 to the acre. Heron Point is what?
I believe that's what Heron Point is.
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, for instance, the DWP site, isn't that zone?
At 20, isn't it?
I think it's a 20. So Jim's point is, even with a zone change, and even with the property owner, although they're on record as saying they prefer to keep their existing use, but they could come before us, and it may be more profitable for them to have a number of single-family homes, just like DWP, thank you, and condos that are selling for $300,000 apiece.
But DWP is a prime example of a property that's zoned for high density, but it's single family that's being developed.
So this is probably pretty close to the square footage for the DWP site, and there were more than 30, how many homes?
Less. 32 homes.
32? There were 32 single-family houses on 4.5 acres. So 20,
That's exactly what a developer would do there.
John can elaborate on that, what state law requires. Once again, state law requires, as he told us earlier, is that we remove the constraints, we remove the obstacles, but it's still going to be dictated by the market. So if they want to put housing there, they're going to get what's the most valuable return on their investment. And so it's going to be determined by market.
And none of this is going to be affordable necessarily.
Not necessarily. Once again, we're removing the obstacle.
We're only making it available. Somebody has to come in and do it. All right, we need to take a vote. What is the pleasure of the commission?
Well, I'm not sure I'll get this right, but I'd like to...
What are our options? Approve or deny?
Approve or deny.
Okay.
I'd like to adopt Resolution 1316 with the stipulation that it be rezoned housing, high density in a limited area, and low density in the remaining area, as we just talked about, where the high density zoning is limited to what is required by 21 dwelling units.
I didn't hear that was feasible, though, because that would require a lot split, from what I understand.
Any subdivision that goes in there is going to have a subdivision map on it with lot splits all over the place, unless it's one big condo development.
It sounds like split zoning, sort of.
Well, it's like a mixed use
I
zone.
thought you said that this was feasible.
Is the split zoning like that going to, I hate to say it, raise a red flag? I don't, at this point, I don't want our city to get, penalized.
Okay, so once again, and you've asked about the options, I'd be recommending that you at least take a vote on the proposal and see if that passes. And either way, if it passes or doesn't pass, you can still ask the council to consider other alternatives. Because ultimately, once again, they're making the decision. It's your recommendation. And it's just like previously, you made your decision, but you made it very clear, at least two of the commissioners made it very clear that they would prefer the council to consider just planning area number 1. And so why don't you take a vote and see what happens, and then consider other alternatives if that's what the commission would like to do.
Is there a motion on the floor?
There's a motion from Commissioner Sloan.
Okay, could you call for the question?
Seconded.
Oh.
Could you clarify your motion?
Well, apparently it wasn't a valid motion.
Well,
You can clarify.
we didn't have an opportunity to second it yet. Do you want to withdraw it?
No, I really don't.
Well, restate it.
I was under the impression, based on Mr. Basham's comment, that the city could consider rezoning the entire accurate storage site residential, but confine only a small section of it, 1 acre, to 20, a density of 20, and the other at 8 or whatever it was. It would not require it wouldn't require any more study on your part. It may not require the owner's approval. I don't know. He's already agreed to rezoning it residential. It seems like it wouldn't hold up our timeline for approving this new housing element. Am I wrong? I mean, no.
Well, you're correct in all accounts, and there's two ways to accomplish that. It's either, well, definitely a vote would be required, but, yeah. I mean, my suggestion would be to adopt the proposal and give direction to the council that you would prefer to see this. It's not going to be an overlay, and that's where we're kind of stumbling here, because we know that the overlay is not going to work. We know HCD is not going to accept that. But if you go with the zoning, with the direction, I mean, once again, the market, you know, I can't speak for the owner, but the market will probably end up to be, if there's ever going to be housing there, it's going to be that type of use, because in this current climate, you can get a lot more for your, you know, more bang for your buck if you've got single, you know, luxury homes, and you can do that just like, once again, a DWP. The DWP site is a prime example. Okay, so to get back to try to clarify the motion, then it's either go with staff's recommendation with direction to the staff, to the council, that you want to have them explore different ways to make sure that it's not all high-density zoning. I mean, that's option number one. And if that doesn't work for you, then we can try another option.
Can you split the zoning? I mean, the owner isn't going to cut the building in half.
No, the whole site would be recycled. They're not going to do that.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, you can't just, yeah.
We can't force the subdivision. That's clear. And we can certainly ask the property owner. But keep in mind, as you saw in that letter, there's been long discussions with the property owner, because it was very important for our city council to get something. It was important for HCD that the owner would accept.
Well, according to this letter, what the owner wants is current use grandfathered in. So that gives him the flexibility to do what he wants.
It would be, it is grandfathered in the next resolution.
That's it, right.
The next item.
So that's...
Okay. All right, so do you know what your motion is yet?
I would like to move for what I said before.
Move for approval.
Move for approval of Resolution 13-6. With the contingency that the council takes under advisement zoning just a section of this area, high density, and the other residential, low density.
Okay.
Is that?
That's clear.
That's very clear.
Okay, is there a second? A second? Okay, can we have another
Okay,
motion?
I got another motion here. I think we should send a message to the council that we think that zoning 4.5 acres, to meet our minimum requirement of 21 here is just way overkill. The location's got issues. I'm not going to go into all the problems with this location. The better spot would be the Boeing parking lot. And I think we should send that message. That's our recommendation. Staff could disagree. Council can do what they want. But I think that's the message we should give them. In terms of Boeing, I appreciate that if we were going to add a planning area 5 to Boeing, that you would need Boeing's concurrence. But I think Boeing would concur. I mean, basically what you're telling Boeing is, or you're trying to get Boeing to agree to, is taking an acre of an unused parking lot and putting 20 units on that they can sell as condos, potentially. I mean, basically you can turn a parking lot into, $5 million, $6 million, or whatever of value. It's like printing money. And I think Boeing would jump at the opportunity to turn a parking lot into a condominium unit or a
Is that your
multifamily.
motion?
So, sorry. So, my motion, that's the rationale for my motion. My motion is very simple, and that is just to vote no on the proposal, and then make a recommendation that the council consider the Boeing. That's my motion.
Is there a second?
Can we discuss this first?
Yes, no, we need a second first. No second? Can't discuss it.
Now we can discuss it?
Can I make a motion?
Yes, make a
Try.
motion.
What?
I'll try.
Let Patty make a motion first.
Much as this has gotten so convoluted, I move for approval. And then let's see where we go from there.
I second the motion.
Okay, now we can have
Discussion.
Okay.
Commissioner Scalone.
I don't object to your idea, Bob, but what's to keep Boeing from building many, many, many units if we do this? Not just on 1 acre, but on the entire planning area 1 zone, for instance.
Because what the city would do is create a planning area 5 that's 1 acre.
Thank you.
Otherwise, and if Boeing's not willing to do that, if Boeing is not willing to create a planning area 5 small area, then the deal's off. But you're going to a property owner and saying, look, you have an unused parking lot, and I'm giving you the option, not the requirement, the option to build 20 homes on an unused parking lot. I don't know. People don't get rich for being stupid. And I think they'd be smart enough to jump on that. And if they're not, fine. Then we can always go back to this accurate storage.
And Boeing may elect to use the lower section of the parking lot right adjacent to accurate storage to do this, not necessarily the parking lot on Westminster.
Well, no, actually, what's on the list is not, what's on the housing element list is not PA1. It's actually limited to the Boeing parking lots, which is just this area up here. The staff can clarify that. But it's not PA1, it's not on the list. It's just the Boeing parking lots.
But parking lots include the lower parking lot of PA1 as well.
No. It's about 17, it's a big area though. I think it's 17 acres. It's a very big area.
The lower parking lot.
It's not the lower, it's not the whole PA1. But still, it's a very large area. 17 acres, 13 acres.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Let's go.
Can we discuss first?
We're discussing. You
Okay.
want more?
We've done all night, Robert.
Okay.
Discuss it.
Okay.
You ready? Three no, 2 yes. So motion fails. All right, next motion.
Well, if we don't have a motion, it just goes on.
It's going to go on to the planning commission without a motion. To the city council.
Okay.
Yes. We'll drop it in their lap.
My earlier question was, if we do nothing, is it deemed to be approved?
No.
Well,
It's
it's
no
not deemed
action.
approved, but, yeah, your recommendation is deemed that you approve it. Goes up to the city council as if you made a recommendation to approve.
If we take no vote?
Right.
That's right.
Okay.
So it goes as approved.
We can still do a motion to recommend what Mr. Sloan's been discussing.
And I trust the staff will put that clearly in the staff report.
We'll do our best.
Okay.
Should that be in the form of a motion, Quinn, to make it stronger, or do we just direct staff?
Either way is fine. It's, and at this point, once again, all these comments are going to be sent up to the council. We'll have lots of people from the audience coming, and lots of people who aren't here are going to be here. Will
And
be
you
at the
can watch it on
council.
TV, too.
So, yeah, it's your option. I mean, at this point, you could say, let's move on to the next item, or you can say, rephrase the motion again on the,
I'd like to just see it go as it is. So it goes as an approval and with a 3-2 negative vote. Make that clear, too. Okay, shall we move on to the next item? We have this last one, and we're finished.
Sort of pointless.
And this is, well, not really, because if the accurate storage space stays on the list,
All right.
then this resolution here will address keeping it as industrial. So can we have the staff report?
and let me just clarify, though, it's not, so all these motions will be sent, the council will be aware of every single one of these motions, so they'll know exactly where you guys ended up.
Okay. All right, can we have a staff report on this last one? Who's doing it? Are you doing it, John?
Yeah, I'll start, and then the city attorney may want to chime in. The impetus behind this item 5 is the city's desire to move forward with the accurate storage zone change in a manner that the property owner can support. And so for the last several months, city staff, city attorney has been working with the owner's representative to address concerns that the owner has regarding what the allowable uses in the future would hold if the city were rezoned such that it became a non-conforming use. And so this municipal code contains provisions as to how non-conforming uses are treated, most notably that non-conforming uses may continue indefinitely even though they don't conform to the zoning. So the owner's representative expressed to us that they had reservations about other options such as uses that would be permitted, different uses that may be permitted under the light industrial zoning. The existing municipal code has restrictions about changing uses or expanding uses that are non-conforming. And so in extensive discussions between the city attorney and Accurate's attorney, there was language worked out that is before you in terms of a code amendment that would provide a little greater flexibility for the property owner to change the use to something else that would not be permitted under the city's existing non-conforming rules, so that they would hopefully not get caught in a situation where maybe there was a change of use, maybe the building went unoccupied for a period of time and then was not able to reestablish a use under the city's current regulations for non-conforming uses. So that's kind of a general overview of the intent here. It's to amend the regulations in such a way so as to not radically change the city's provisions regarding nonconforming uses, but to modify them so as to address the property owner's concerns and ensure that the property owner supports the zone change. I would be happy to try to answer any questions, or I would ask if the city attorney has anything to add to that at this point.
I have nothing to add, but I'm here to answer any questions as well.
Any questions of the staff? Commissioner Goldberg.
The way it's worded right now, I understand if he were to want to reinstitute the metal fabrication business that he had before, this would allow him to change the business type to whatever is light manufacturing. Okay.
Yes.
What I'm confused on is what if he wanted to go from a 65,000 square foot building, which is plus or minus what it is now, to a 100,000 square foot building, if he wanted to build a larger building and do a different purpose there? Would this item before us allow him to expand the walls or knock this or completely demolish this building and build a new building for light manufacturing?
The standards against which any proposal would be reviewed is the existing standards for the light industrial zone. So if they came in with a proposal to expand the building, the city would review the application, review the plans to see if they conform to the existing light industrial zoning district, and if it complies, then it's my understanding that it could be approved.
And you don't think giving them this much flexibility would be a red flag to HCD?
It is possible, and I'll tell you, in working with HCD for many years, we don't have the luxury of asking them what if this and what if that and getting a straight answer every time.
That's the truth. Any other questions?
No.
Anyone else have a question?
We have to have
I think this is pretty straightforward.
do we have a public hearing on it? Yes.
We're still discussing.
Oh, okay. I have no comment.
I think this is pretty straightforward. It's a guarantee to the property owner that he can continue to do what he wants to do there, and that there would be no pressure from anyone, actually, to make it residential. I think that's a good thing. Okay, we'll open the public hearing. Anyone like to speak?
I want to make sure that the owner's comments are in the records. Obviously, he supports this. It's really important to him. Right now, the city attorney talked about how he wants to do with the property what the market bears, and right now the market bears industrial uses. And so he wants to be able to continue that. And he wants to be able to sell his property at some point, potentially, and ensure that the successor will also be able to use the property for we worked long and hard. Staff was very, very helpful in crafting something that we think is really a win-win for the city and for the owner.
Good. Thank you. And this is only in the light industrial section, right? Okay. All right. I'm going to close the public hearing, seeing no one else that wants to speak. Do we have a motion or discussion? What would you like? Pretty straightforward. Make a motion.
I'd like to move to adopt Resolution 13-7 as written.
Okay.
I will second that.
Please vote. 5-0. Okay. Thank you to those who stuck it out. We appreciate your, you had no choice. We appreciate you, your perseverance, and thank you for being here this evening. Let's see, director's comments?
Just 2 comments. The RFP for the local coastal program deadline passed. We did receive proposals. We're reviewing them, and we'll hold interviews and then hopefully present, and with recommendation to City Council in first or second meeting in May. The RFP for the Pier Restaurant, the deadline for that RFP is, I believe, next Friday, is April 12th. And hopefully we will receive several responses for that one. And that concludes that. That concludes my comments.
How many responses have we received so far?
For the Pier Restaurant?
Yeah.
None, but it's to my understanding that there are several that contacted our property management company, because that's where the RFP proposals are required to be sent to, have indicated that they are going to submit.
Good. Okay, are there any commissioners' comments? Commissioner Goldberg?
One thing that is just an idea, is that when I came on the commission, I got a hard copy of the municipal code, and this was a couple of years ago. Actually, mine is dated October 11th, 2010, and it's very useful to have a hard copy. And what I'm wondering, is there some way that staff can give us updates in hard copy so that I have what I have right here as all the latest? Because I know there's been several changes, and I appreciate it's a little bit harder with hard copy, but I'd like to keep this up to date, and maybe I could promise when I leave Planning Commission, I'll give this back to staff so that they can give this to the next Planning Commissioner.
Well, I'm sure we can coordinate with the city clerk's office.
The copy I have goes back to 1996.
I think it's a little out of date. Got new numbers. Is that all?
Yes, thank you.
Commissioner Campbell? Commissioner Cummings? Commissioner Sloan?
You know, there were a lot of irate folks in the audience today because they didn't receive, as we talked about extensively, notice of these proposed changes. And I was wondering if someone in staff, maybe, could take the action of coming up with recommendations to improve this process. I don't know if that's feasible and within, well, recommendations are certainly feasible and within your jurisdiction, but maybe we should do something a little bit more than we're doing now to notify the public.
Okay.
500 feet, 2 notices in 2 different papers,
Well, on this issue particularly, and thank you for bringing that up, I would ask staff to do 500 feet on this, which would catch a few more homes in Heron Point on this one.
We did do 500 feet, and I have the mailing labels that show that these folks have been notified.
They
The
just
ones
didn't.
that fall within that area, as I indicated for the record.
They don't open their mail.
They didn't read it. They didn't understand the significance.
Maybe it would be something to consider is to take out a quarter-page ad in the Sun, like we used to have to do. I don't know if you still have to do it, for citywide code amendments and general plan amendments. So if that's not around anymore, that might not be a bad idea, so people will see a quarter-page ad in the paper. More likely to see it.
This is the age-old problem. We've had this for years.
Every year you'll hear something
They
about
don't
it.
read, and then what do you do?
Okay.
Well, maybe there's nothing you can do, but, if you could look at it, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, meeting's adjourned.
Somewhere there was a reference.